I'm the chair of the James City County Board of Supervisors, and I represent Virginia Association of Counties. Cindy.
Good morning, Cindy Mester, Community Relations and Legislative Affairs for the City of Falls Church, and I represent VML on this spot.
Next.
Good morning, Raymond Smoot from Montgomery County. It's nice to watch the sunrise across the Commonwealth this morning. And I serve on CTB. I guess I'm representing CTB with this group. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Noelle Pinkard. I'm the Organizational Advancement Officer for Hampton Roads Transit, and I represent VTA.
Good morning. I'm Kate Mattice. I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. I'm also representing the Virginia Transit Association.
Good morning. I'm Paula Melister, the Director of Transportation at the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission, and I am representing DRPT.
I'm Brian Booth, the Director of Blacksburg Transit in Blacksburg, Virginia at CTAP.
Great. And I think do we have anybody online from the committee? Doesn't appear to be the case, but all right. Well, we have a very big agenda today, but we also have some interesting changes to talk about. And so I'm going to turn it over first of all to our new director, Maria Zimmerman.
Great.
Welcome, and I know you're going to find this to be an exciting, thrilling committee.
Thank you. I'm sure I will already. Just reviewing the materials for today has been interesting. So yes, welcome. Hello, everyone. Hello, those who are watching online. I'm Maria Zimmerman. Today is my very first day as director of DRPT. So I will largely be in a listen mode today. I did get a great briefing from the staff and contractors and others coming into this. I know I'm sort of catching you midway through working on what will be a key thing of discussion today. But also, you know, we're a new administration. We have a new secretary, so we don't want to get in the way of good work that has already happened, but we want to make sure what goes forward is really aligned with our policy goals and objectives as well. So very interested to hear the conversation and kind of where things are at, where we've got consensus, where we might need to do a little bit more conversation, discussion, digging into things. I am a longtime transit supporter and fan. I have spent time at the federal level, both at the Federal Transit Administration as well as with the Office of the Secretary most recently during the Biden administration. But I've also been a planning and policy consultant for a number of years. In those capacities, I've gotten to work with some different parts of the state. So some work in Hampton Roads and Charlottesville, Blacksburg. I lived in Arlington for a number of years, but I've lived here in Richmond and used GRTC here regularly. So I'm just very excited for the work and for this committee. So thank you all for your service on it. And thanks to the staff and the team who quickly got me up to speed, not just my first day, but like the first hour basically of being on the job. So with that, I think we also have another introduction here today too.
So I will take that. So we want to welcome Paula Melister, who is our newest DRPT appointee to TSDAC. She is going to be replacing Jamie Jackson. So I will just introduce her from her bio. She is the Director of Transportation for the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission. She joined the CSPDC in 2021, first as a transit planner. During her time at the CSPDC, she has managed the newly launched Afton Express commuter bus service and served as the project manager for the Lewis Street Transit Hub construction project. In her current role as director, she oversees Bright Transit, a transportation program including 2 metropolitan planning organizations and a rural transportation planning program. She has a master's of public administration from James Madison University, go Dukes, where she worked for 14 years prior to joining the CSPDC. So Paula, welcome. We will hope to get you up to speed today with all things merit and all the work we've done over the last few months.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that introduction, and welcome to the committee. I think you'll find that a lot of work has gone in over the course of about 14 years now. And
Time flies.
it does fly, but it's so great to have everybody here in person today. I know it's been a kind of disjointed thing in the last few months and years as we met virtually. Hopefully this will be a nice reminder of our ability to get through a lot of material, very complex material, and do so in a way that's constructive and helpful for the agency and for public transit throughout the Commonwealth. With that, let me move on for a moment to the minutes of the November meeting and ask if anybody has any corrections or amendments to those minutes. Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes have been approved. Okay, now I think I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to handle the beginning of the presentation.
Thank you. So we're going to pull up the presentations and share it with those online. So what we really wanted to start off with is what we heard from you all. We've obviously been working on this endeavor in earnest for the last 10 months. And we wanted to make sure that we were really hearing all of you as well as our stakeholder group as we continue this work over the next few months to try to bring it to fruition. And some of the things that we heard I wanted to highlight for this group was that we wanted to make sure that we were providing the goals up front. To Maria's point, as we dive into the goals, some of those things may change as we have a new administration, we have the General Assembly in. So we will be adaptable and fluid as we move through that. We also wanted to make sure we were being really clear about what problems we were trying to address. So we want to make sure that we spent time identifying where the concerns were with the current formula and then how we thought the changes that we were proposing would fix those problems. We also wanted to make sure that we are all on the same page about additional data. I think we all agree as a group we need more. So the agency is working on a study to try to identify what data we can continue to gather and use for this effort. But understanding that's going to be a long-term endeavor and we're not going to have additional data for this effort. But hopefully we will have more and better and, information that we can use as we continue to do this review every 3 years. One of the things we talked about was trying to present the capital changes and the administrative changes up front. I think there was less concern and consternation around those recommended changes. And so we were hoping we could have those conversations and maybe put a pin in those recommendations and really spend the bulk of our time working through operating. We wanted to give you guys a full recap. So as you guys probably saw from the presentation, it's pretty long. We have 75 slides and our goal is not to go through all 75 slides, but we wanted to make sure you had the information that you needed. So as we do the presentation, we want this to be interactive. We can stop anywhere we need to have conversation and discussion, but we really want this to be a workshop style where we can whiteboard and talk through anything that's still in question. Hi, how are you?
Sorry, late.
That's okay.
You fine, we'll do that.
That's for sure. We also want to make sure that we highlight the questions that we've received from TSDAC and stakeholders and make sure we're addressing any concerns that are still out there. Again, as I talked about, we're going to try to make this more of a workshop style. So hopefully it'll be a little more interactive, especially since we're all in person, than having done it across a computer screen over the last few months. And then at the end of each meeting, we really want to make sure that we have a plan for the next meeting. What are parking lot items we need to address for you still? If there's questions that come up or things we need to deep dive into, we'll make that a priority. So our agenda is we're going to talk through the policy goals as they existed for the last 10 months, but again, they may change. We're going to talk through very quickly the TSDAC resolution and the final approved CTV resolution. So we all know kind of what we're working toward from a timeline perspective. We are going to talk through the 2028 application timeline, just so we all have a sense of how that flows and how it impacts the decisions we make in this room. And then we'll dive into capital and operating, and we'll end with discussion and next steps. So we've talked about a lot of different goals. We've talked about policy goals, we've talked about formula goals, and sometimes all of those things get confused. So we wanted to highlight what our intentions were 10 months ago as we started this process and our overarching policy goals at that time. And it was really to try to focus on performance-based metrics, looking more at how we get outputs versus always just looking at the inputs that are going into our transit systems. We wanted to make sure we had good asset utilization and verification of agency needs. We wanted to promote operational efficiency. And we also wanted to make sure that we were looking at return on investment. So the money that's going in, what is that coming back to the Commonwealth in terms of our transit agencies and ridership and the output measures that each of our transit agencies look at. And then we wanted to look at nationwide best practices. So again, all of these things are in flux as we have a new administration and a General Assembly session that we'll probably talk about later this afternoon. There's bills dropping that are going to impact this process. And so we don't want to lose that as we move forward over the next few months. We just kind of wanted to remind everybody of the different roles of the different bodies. So we've talked about this slide in the past, but the different roles between CTB, TSDAC, and DRPT. Ultimately, CTB approves our recommendations and helps carry them forward so we can implement them from a policy perspective. But this body is the one that we will consult with to help make recommendations for the CTB to be able to move things forward. So we did want to remind everybody of the resolution. So we met last at the end of November, and this body made a recommendation that we continue to build upon the work that we had done, but give ourselves a little more time to make sure we understood the implications. So this body made a recommendation that we would go to CTV workshop in May of 2026 with an action in June of 2026 to help make updates to the operating formula for merit. We appreciated the comments about the work that had been done so far and the goal to really try to get this across the finish line. When we presented that recommendation to CTB, they agreed. However, the chair of CTB asked that we move the timeline up slightly. And so the final approved CTB resolution asks that this body comes back and makes a formal recommendation to CTB in April of 2026 with action in May of 2026. Again, all of that could change as we move through this process, but for now, that's kind of the timeline that we're working with and how we've laid the meetings out. So we just wanted to remind everybody of the public comment that we heard. So we did put out the recommendations for public comment. We heard from some groups that this fit their service model better. We heard from some that this was helpful for like our smaller, more rural transit agencies, but we also got some concerns. So we got a lot of concerns around the process and the timing. And so that's one of the reasons we really wanted to dive into the timeline for how our grant process flows, as well as our code requirements for implementing change and like how long we have before we can implement a change and actually make it effective. So we just wanted to remind everybody of those timelines. We got strong opposition from OmniRide and those in NOVA who were losing funding. We wanted to make sure that, again, we captured those thoughts and that feedback. And we have those recommendations for administrative changes where we think we can kind of help commuter bus resolve some of the concerns that they have since their funding model is different. So we'll work through that as we talk through the presentation today. So we did want to just remind everybody of how our application process flows. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan Sonaclair, who's just going to talk us through quickly how our application timeline works.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. I'll just stand here. So this slide outlines all of the various different steps that go into the development of our applications to include in the next round of reviews for the upcoming SIP. The goal here was always to implement changes by the FY28 cycle. And so we're outlining here what all of those steps are. And so really the key takeaway here is there's two things to keep in mind. With capital changes, it's best if we have any final changes kind of wrapped up and approved by the September-October timeframe. In order to design the applications to fit the new program that this committee and CDP ultimately decide on. But ultimately, the deadline for updating any of or making any of these decisions with CTV would be January 1st, because that would be 6 months prior to July 1st, which by code we need to have any operating changes approved by that deadline. So that's kind of the lay of the land here, but each of these bullets just spell out a separate step in that process. So we just wanted to remind everybody about that. Any questions before I turn it back over? Great. Yeah.
Thank you. This might be a good place for me to put just to recap the mood that I think we got from our previous meeting, which was essentially to say that there was an understanding that there was it was an important time to go through and take a look at the subsidies and support for transit from the state, but that we knew that there were folks who weren't really clear on exactly what was driving those changes, and that there needed a little bit more opportunity for the chance to get some clarification, to talk through some of these issues with staff, and find out exactly how they may be likely to impact the various agencies across the Commonwealth. I think that there were some very obvious areas in which there was concern or opposition expressed, but I think the overall concern was simply that there was a felt need for a little more time to come to grips with the changes that were being proposed. And so I hope that as we go through today's session and subsequent sessions this spring or summer, winter, that will get us an ability to sort of address the concerns, move on, and hopefully come to a conclusion in a way that's consistent with the desires of the CTV, which we appreciate very much in terms of saying, yes, let's go ahead and extend this process. So with that, I just wanted to make clear that this is very much appreciated, the opportunity to address it, but that hopefully we will be able to kind of circle in on those items that really need additional and information or enhancement or reconsideration, and try to build on that as we go through the next couple of meetings. Just leave it with that.
We also had Jim Dyke, who's joined us too, just missed introduction. So we have a number of folks online, and hello, I'm Maria Zimmerman, the new director, but very nice to meet you.
Same here. Jim Dyke. Want a background or anything like that?
Just
The introduction.
Jim, it would take too long.
That's why I asked the question.
Everybody has mentioned who they're representing on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Nice to meet you. Look forward to working.
Mr. Chair, can I just add on to that? I do think we have an incredible opportunity going into the year to sort of maybe have a reexamination of how we use this group. And I think that a lot of the challenges last year, I know it's hard to see with the comments, when you have a comment from somebody like Virginia Transit Association, it's actually 11 entities that came together. It's not one comment, it's 11 comments. And Chair, I think you grabbed it right. Folks weren't concerned about making the change, it's the understanding of change. I think we were faced with a lot of dynamics last year where I think there was an incredible amount of staff level work done by DRPT and the consultant team, and somewhat kind of, my words, baked before it was even brought to us. And I think like our own learning curve and the industry's learning curve and understanding sort of what got from here to there may have been months and months of staff time. If I go back, because I'm one of these people who've been around for a long time in this organization, usually that's done with us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the challenge of the timeline, there's a lot of things that were done literally in the middle of summer. And I do hope that as we move forward on that, when we have localities that want to be able to make formal public comment, being provided something in the middle of summer and asking for a public comment, they may not even have a board that can authorize them to do that. And I think that was a big part of sort of what was going on. So again, I see an incredible opportunity. Obviously, the key thing, and I really appreciate Ms. Mayton mentioning, we have a new administration. What are their priorities, right? And so, you know, not day one, Madam Director, but at some point, what does this look like in terms of the priorities of this administration? Because we know what was happening last time was the previous administration. So maybe there's some things that are the same. That's great. But I do appreciate, I know it's hard to come for a day and take off time. But the in-person thing is what got us through all the major changes in the past. And I think is a valuable, while it's a whole day for many of us coming to and from, the in-person collaboration, I think is going to put us in a better space when it's, planned ahead and all that good stuff versus doing the online as well. So I appreciate the moment to add to that a little bit of context, and I look forward to what we can do this year to make the program better.
Thanks, Kate.
If I could, John, I also want to kind of build on all that data stuff. And another thank you to staff, because as you worked with John and I for this meeting packet and, 75 slides, you were kind enough to take all my details and reorganization and structure, because I think it was important. We had so many meetings and so much good staff work, but they were like presentation here, presentation there, and you got the core stuff for this resource document. Not that we will go through all the slides, but it's here. It was very helpful. This timeline was one of the things that we had talked about, but it wasn't actually in any slide deck. So thank you for putting it in there, but also the summary appendix stuff where you put this meeting, this scenario, allowed for the deeper dive for us to work through together. So I just wanted to put that context that having all this in one place is very helpful.
Right. Thank you, Cindy. Anybody else have comments at this point? Now we can move on.
All right, so we will dive into capital first. Like I said, we won't go through every single slide in depth, but if we get to a slide and we skip over it and there's questions, we can absolutely go back to it. We do want to make sure we're cognizant of time so that we do allow for that discussion and workshopping.
On the capital side of things, there's going to be 3 introductory slides that just explain the capital program, the 3 categories of projects. And unless there are any questions, I'm going to skim right through those because we've stared at them many, many times. 4 slides. But really the key findings from last year was that in general, those methodologies used to prioritize and fund capital projects were in alignment with DRPT goals. The things we found were some of those things around the edges. So some projects didn't fit neatly into the scoring methodologies. We talked a lot about SGR projects and MIN projects and how those are have a lot of similarities in the scoring, but there are SGR projects that don't have that clear estimated service life. And so making sure that those projects are distinguished between the MIN projects. As well as those major projects, those are the projects over $3 million. And those projects, most of what DRPT receives are projects to replace or rehab an existing asset. And it just doesn't really align with the smart scale scoring categories. And so distinguishing between those major projects that are repairing versus those major projects that are making a huge improvement. The other thing we talked about was that there are vehicle expansion projects, and there's a distinguishing between is the project for 5 vehicles or 5% of the fleet, more or less than that, and what category you fell into was determined. If you were 4 or 6, you had different match ratios, and so we talked about the need to maybe just streamline that process. And then the incentive categories, we found that some of those weren't receiving the intended results. And so talked about removing those ones and then adding 2 to really encourage agencies to progress projects and make sure funds that are allocated are being used. So with those key findings, the proposed improvements, we're adding subcategories for SGR projects, those SGRs without asset condition scores and SGR with asset condition scores, distinguishing between those major projects. And then that would require a new scoring methodology for those major projects. Eliminating that 5% fleet requirement, and then redoing the incentive points to eliminate those underutilized categories and add categories to incentivize. I'm going to pause here because I think this is the slide that is the bulk of the proposed improvements. And so wanted to see if there's any questions on that. And we have some more slides that go into detail on some of those improvements, but if there aren't questions, we don't need to go through those. If there are, we can certainly dive deeper.
Let me ask that anybody have any questions in particular about this aspect? And again, I think it's important for us to, as Kate suggested before, have things in context. And it is important to remember that this is not the formal charge of TSDAC to look at the capital formula, but it is crucial for the operation of transit systems, and therefore it's kind of hard to ignore. And so we really do appreciate the fact that there is time and effort being devoted to allowing us to comment on this particular aspect, and look for the responses of the transit agencies on that front as well. Anybody have anything they'd like to add on this? Okay.
Just one plus one that point, because I do think it needs to be holistic, and TSDAC has heard me before, even if it's not our formal charge, I do think there's value in us having a recommendation related to this. But from a content standpoint, I haven't heard any issues or concerns for those that I represent.
John?
Yes.
I think at least most of the CTB members would be what I'm getting ready to say. And that is that we really know little about this. But the desire, of course, of everyone engaged, I think, is to assure that we are providing the best service we can to the people who need or utilize the service, and that we're also providing a good return on the taxpayer involvement that goes into funding this. CTB has nothing to do with, per se, with funding. The legislature appropriately appropriates the money, and whatever it is what we have to use. So I think as we think about coming up with something that will go back to the CTB, we need to first remember that the CTB, unlike most of the people in this room, is not thinking about this every day or every week or every month. And we will need to focus, I think, on just a few things. We think we can improve the service or the efficiency of the service or whatever. Lay those before the CTB and make it fairly easy to understand why we're doing that. I don't think there's anyone on CTB who would claim to know more about this, or even as much about this as anyone in this room. So we need to keep that in mind as we tee up something eventually to bring to them.
Great, thanks for those comments. I appreciate it very much. Ryan?
Skipping ahead a couple slides, but I was looking at those formula for the SGR major. And it's just curious, understand how it's getting to that major SGR score, but is there an established benchmark that score would be compared to for funding the project that would be funded, or is that still to be developed?
So it's still to be developed on the specifics of it, but there's obviously so much funding available, and so how how you rank those top projects are the ones that receive funding based on how much is available.
Okay, any other questions or comments?
Operating, if no more questions like happen.
Now, let's just stop for a second and say, obviously, we want to receive any public comment that might result from this meeting today. But I guess I'm curious about whether, in general, the recommendations appear to make sense in this case, and whether we can sort of move from capital onto other areas and say we've done this absent any additional information or concerns that are expressed.
I haven't heard any concerns with the proposal on the capital side at all.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, great.
And I agree. And then, so the only thing I would say is that we do have a February meeting
Right.
and we purposely have time between these two meetings so we can reach back out
That's-
to our
that's exactly right.
stakeholders. So to your point, absent any other public, I do want to encourage that that's an opportunity.
Yes, yes. And I think that's,
As I said, I'm fine and haven't heard.
again, I want to reiterate the idea that we were successful in asking for an extension of our consideration here. We obviously have other factors that will come into play, especially a change in administration and any policy changes they might have in mind. But we also want to make sure that we're using our time most productively. And if we've reached a point where we can say, yes, this makes sense, we recommend adoption of it, then that's fine. Or if we, very specifically get feedback that says, okay, here we go. This is something that you really need to look at more carefully because that's what we want to be able to do at our next go round.
Expect operating is going to be our.
Yes, right. Yeah.
No surprise.
As the legislature said.
I do think it's helpful to hear. We've got consensus at this point, barring
Right.
additional input that we get, that the proposed changes on the capital side, TSDAC is comfortable to push us forward. So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think it's over to Nate. Oh, because we're gonna do the administrative changes first. That's great.
So 2 slides here highlighting the administration as we were kind of moving through the scenarios and some of the issues. So the first one, or just the summary of this one, is that we are proposing changing the way that we approach how we calculate vehicle revenue hours, our passengers per vehicle revenue hour and passengers per vehicle revenue mile for those agencies that are receiving a bonus essentially in their sizing metrics for counting the unidirectional 20-mile or longer routes in their revenue hours and miles. And so to take a step back about the 20 miles or longer, when we passed the resolution or the CTB policy back in 2018, in order to address some of the concerns that came up with commuter bus providers specifically, we included a provision that allows those commuter bus providers to count deadhead miles and hours for routes that are unidirectional in nature, meaning they have to deadhead back home in the middle of the day in their sizing metric for hours and miles. And that carried through to then calculating the performance metrics that utilize those measures on the performance adjustment side of the formula, which puts them at a slight disadvantage. Essentially, it increases the numerator of hours or miles and does not increase the denominator of, increases the passengers, the lower portion of it, it increases the denominator, but not the numerator. So it leads to a lesser metric when doing that. So the idea here is that for the performance metric adjustments, we would count just their revenue hours and miles without the additional deadhead miles that are counted in there to put them on a more of an even field with everybody else. That is the first one, and I can pause. I know there might be questions about this one. Yes.
I do have a question. Again, this is why it's so great to have this venue because I'm not sure I had the opportunity to ask this question before. How many systems in Virginia would be affected by this?
There are 3 systems that are currently reporting that, and they have varying degrees of commuter service that they are reporting.
And so when you do a definition of commuter service, are those like NTD definition?
NTD.
Okay. So while some may have characteristics like this, it's only those get categorized.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep, no problem. Other questions on this one? Okay. Second one, it was concerning the definitions around 2 different metrics that we use in the operating formula: operating costs per system sizing versus operating costs per performance metrics. And the idea here is to move away from the operating sizing metric and just utilize the cost per performance metric for both sizing and performance. And so I'll take a step back on this one as well and kind of further define what these 2 things mean. Operating cost for performance metrics is essentially the fully loaded cost of the audited expenses that went into each agency in the previously audited fiscal year, less things like depreciation, ineligible costs that are in their audited expenses, and other non-transit related expenses. So essentially that operating cost for performance is the fully loaded audited cost that we use to set the 30% sizing or cap and to kind of run the performance adjustments. The operating cost for system sizing also reduced those costs by projects that were funded with other DRPT programs that do not have an explicit impact on operating. And so what that meant was that if the agency received a demonstration assistance or technical assistance grant from us, that we would take that out of their operating cost for their sizing metric. But this also applied to additional funds that run through our SIP, which includes some of the funds that we distribute based on that we get from the hot lanes in Northern Virginia and other regional funds that also come through our 6-year improvement. So the idea here is to put everybody on an equal playing field for sizing metrics, is to just use the fully loaded cost instead of the sizing.
I really am trying to understand why. If they're innovative and they get grants, why are we penalizing them?
And that's what we're
That's the
moving.
question.
We want to move.
It's getting away from.
That's what we're
Yeah.
solving
So
for.
they're
right?
innovative and they've got grants,
Yeah.
but they won't be able to get DRP in
That's the path.
reimbursement
That's
on the
current.
value of their grants.
That's currently, right. That's what we're.
Currently,
solving
so you're
for.
trying to get away from that.
Exactly.
Thank you. See, now we got this double negative. All
Thank you.
right, that's what I want to make sure I
It's a
understood.
very hard one to explain.
Can you give us an example of
Well,
something that would be excluded?
Sure.
Well, I think it came from really like people were getting trip grants for things like, whether it even be, I don't remember Zero Fare, but things where they were, yes, trying to expand their service. And again, we would perhaps penalize them for going after, just because it was state money. You know, it makes sense. Maybe you don't want it to double dip per se, but again, we were disincentivizing them going after other programs and trying to expand their services.
So you're correcting that.
It's just sort of a
that problem.
philosophical, decision on our part to say, even though it may also be public funding you're using, you know, that takes work to go after it and to innovate and expand. So why don't we not just disincentivize it, you know? versus- that
See how
was-
confused we were?
I can just add, there's a lot of nuance to the operating cost for system sizing currently, because what is defined as a DRPT program is kind of unclear. We pass a lot of money, whether it's state, federal funding, if it's CMAQ, or we pass a lot of money through DRPT. There's 66 IOEP, and it just, there are a lot of judgment calls on the fly with a very small amount of time to kind of crunch all these numbers for every single agency. So we kind of saw it as a weakness as part of our process, because we're not consistent with the operating cost for performance versus the operating cost for sizing. So this kind of streamlines and simplifies it.
And have we gotten any comments from any of the providers on this particular aspect at this point?
I'm pretty sure we got one public comment that was positive, that said that they would like to see this. We do think our transit providers will appreciate this because it's less data they'll have to provide to DRPT at the start of the grant process when we're trying to identify what their operating costs look like.
Yeah.
But we've only gotten one comment on this particular.
Well, it sounds like a really important change and a very positive one. Might be the kind of thing you want to headline.
Yeah, right.
You know, if you will, so that transit systems know what the impact is.
Sure.
If I can note just a couple of more details about this, is that this, not only do we think that this will make things more fair, it also highly simplifies our financial processes of reviewing the audited expenses. And so there's efficiencies gained there. But also, I think it moves us away from what I've always seen as a bit of a misnomer, that we use this operating cost for sizing, thinking of it as reimbursable expenses, when in reality, it's a scaling. Cost in the formula is a proxy for size. It's not about reimbursing on those costs because we give the money for the next year. It's to set up a sizing scale that we use to then distribute the money for the following year. So to me, this is a huge efficiency gain from a DRPCT perspective, but it also makes it more fair for external agencies.
So, Chair, I had one maybe technical question, and then two, it may be more of a policy question that ties it to the operating. So right now, operating costs, you have the word in there, audited operating, and performance metrics, it's not audited. So it simplifies it. Does that also change the timing of when data is available?
It should not. The performance metric data is also audited.
So
When we say audited on here, this is coming from our official definitions that went into a lot of our documents, and they go through a financial audit, and that's why that made it in there. But we do review all of the performance data as well before it gets into the formula.
So in the new performance metrics,
Still the same.
I guess as a local government person, audited to me is my third person out, certified, they delivered.
Yeah, the financial data we're using is still consistent across all. It's just, we were backing some things out previously that we're proposing not to back out anymore. Yes, we consistently use the same year financial data that's audited. It's just we were backing certain things out through this process that we are proposing to not potentially back out anymore. So now we don't, yeah, that's what changed the data in each scenario, was just taking certain things out, but it's the same overall comprehensive financial data.
Which for us is audited data
Yeah,
that they're
yeah, we're getting
providing.
it from their local audit.
So since this is administrative, it might be, I would just suggest maybe we look at that definition to make sure it's clear, because for me, audited is
Sure.
means something. If it's gone, it also means something. And then as we go through the operating, I was trying to take these concepts and see how does it apply when we change different levers and the operating. So if you maybe, I don't know if you can comment on that now, but or when we get to that point, kind of connect the dots back in with administrative change.
I think you'll be able to see it in illustration. Yeah, when you start looking at the illustrations again about the operating formula, it'll make a little more sense. Yeah.
But connect the dots for me.
To that point, keep an eye on the sizing metrics going forward, because that's essentially where this will have an impact. It will slightly increase the operating cost for sizing for a number of agencies in the state. Not many. We did a sensitivity analysis, and it's not a ton of people that are having costs backed out, but they were significant enough to make the change. The last thing I'll mention about this is that this is considered an administrative change because it's not currently in the CTV policy. So this is something that we've defined as part of technical guides that go into the program, similar to the performance metric change that we've provided here. And so that's why it's kind of considered first before getting into the formula. Questions?
And just to be clear, for tying it to the operating, it's both slides. So both administrative changes, not just the last one.
It would be helpful, I think, to also state whatever the change is, the recommended change is, how it will enhance service and efficiency in the system. So the connection is probably well understood in this room, but it won't be well understood outside of this room.
And Dan, just go forward to slide. I mean, we're going to get to it anyway. So, and that operating cost is where this size of measure is.
Nate, over to you.
Right. Okay. So we're going to shift gears and talk about, what is clearly within the TSDAC mandate to look at the operating assistant. So we're going to start with some review about the current formula. We'll move quickly through that. We want to talk through the challenges with that and the solutions that we've investigated in previous meetings. I know that a lot of this material is review for members of TSDAC. So we're going to be handling this. Some of these will go through more quickly than others, and happy to pause for questions or discussion wherever folks have it, but move through the materials that are review relatively quickly here. The good news is we're about halfway through the deck, but it's probably the discussion we've had to date so far. So let's start with the current formula first, and the important things to keep in mind here, there's really three major pieces to it. There's the sizing piece where we're determining how much funding should go to each agency based on 4 measures of the relative size of each agency, based on their operating costs, their ridership, and then how much service they're providing in terms of hours and miles of service, vehicle revenue, hours and miles of service. An important clarification I want to make is that when we do talk about vehicle revenue hours and miles, it includes deadhead miles and hours for commuter bus service. So that is part of the existing formula, and all of the proposals in here continue to maintain that definition, which was made several years ago to reflect the unique nature of commuter bus, which has significant deadhead mileage relative to typical local bus service.
How do you define deadhead?
It would be the portion of the route in which the bus would be returning to the beginning of the route or back to the garage. And in the case of commuter bus, your deadhead miles can be twice what your revenue miles will be, because these buses are, coming from Woodbridge into DC, and then they're going back empty in a morning commute, and then bringing more passengers in maybe 2 or 3 or more times per morning. And then it's the reverse in the afternoon, where a local bus might, if a route is 10, 15 miles, there might only be a mile or 2 of deadhead at the beginning or end of it as the route goes in and out of service. There's much less deadhead in a local bus route.
So how do you classify a return trip that also carries passengers? Although it may be 4 or 5 passengers coming one way and 50 going the other way.
It could be a revenue service. So as long as that bus is open for a passenger to board and use the bus, that would count as a revenue service hour. And that would be counted any sort of bus service that is being operated by agencies in the state.
One kind of anecdotal comment I hear in CTB, walking up Broad Street or whatever, well, there was another bus with 4 people on it. Well, that same bus might have had 60 people on it going in the other direction, and that's coming back, which it has to come back.
Right.
But it only has 4 people on it. So if they had closed the bus coming back, it would have improved the metrics that you're using, but it would not have improved the service.
And I think that's why some transit agencies, though, are looking at, what is that service provision? Because you might be going into the downtown, and like you're saying, the ride in, there's a lot of people. The ride out, there's not so many. But I think that is a consideration for many transit agencies thinking about that. But that is different than a commuter bus that nobody is, right, it truly is dead, so.
I just wanted, so Danny went over and talked about the changes in the performance measures, and then you just said they're not going to be in the sizing metrics. Does that mean these new definitions are going to be in the performance? I'm just understanding, we just had a conversation about
taking deadheading out.
Take deadhead out, and you just said they're in, and so I'm just wondering, well, then where are they out?
This is the current.
So, yeah.
But Nate also
But
said
I'm just
going
going to what Nate,
forward.
I just got a little confused by what Nate said.
Yeah, Dan, can you explain the way it works currently and then what we're proposing?
Sure. So what I was proposing was on the step 2 side of it, or step X as we're referring to later on.
That's
in the performance metric side of it. So in the sizing metrics, commuter bus will still be able to count deadhead
That's
for
what I,
unidirectional.
thank you. I just want to get it confirmed because it could get confusing and I was getting confused.
Sure.
Others may be confused. Okay.
Yeah, but then, it's on the other side. It just puts them on the same plane.
Okay.
Okay, so then step 2 is the adjustment. So we first allocate funds based on the relative size of each agency. Then there's a performance-based adjustment to that based on these various measures. Each has an equal weight, 20% of the overall adjustment, that then nudges funding up or down based on the relative performance for the factors that are shown there. And importantly, no agency can receive more than 30% of operating assistance from the state. So any agency that approaches 30%, they cap out. That's the maximum reimbursement that they can receive. And the funds that are be allocated to them that's over and above 30%, then go back into the pool and the process starts over again. So this is a bit of an iterative process, and we go through it as many times as needed until there are no crumbs to be redistributed from the agencies that cap out at 30%. So you may have to run this 2 or 3 or 4 times, depending on how many agencies cap out. So that's the current formula, important reference for us as we look at the challenges with that. So we have here, what are some of the challenges and what are some of the proposed solutions that have been examined over the last few months by DRPT and TSDAC. So one of the first ones is that it's input focused, and that by using operating costs to the significant degree that it is making a large portion of the sizing allocation based on an input rather than an output of the service that's provided. There's also the question of how you incentivize performance of all operators, because there's different operational goals for talking commuter bus, local bus, demand response. Those operating in rural areas are going to have a different service pattern than perhaps a demand response service within an urban area. So we need to incentivize the performance of all operators. Formula is complex. We've talked about the ways already today in which some elements of the formula are complex. And then so what part of what we were looking at was, are there ways that we could simplify the formula in order to make it a little clearer for folks along the way? And then there's annual variability, that the amount that agencies receive can vary year to year. We've seen that historically. We had some graphs of this in a previous presentation at TSDAC, but absent any changes in the formula, so leaving the current allocation approach as is, what we've seen over, looking back over a 3-year period, is that the number of agencies that saw some changes in their funding go up or down by more than 10% was approximately 15 to 20% of the agencies each year. So even when we don't change the formula, there's variability in what agencies receive, and the reasons for that is often has to do with how their performance changes relative to the statewide. Part of what was driving that over the last few years was the fact that some agencies were coming out of COVID impacts in their communities at different rates than others. So those that were seeing stronger ridership gains initially and then sort of topped out might have seen some growth in their funds early. Those that were slower to recover to previous ridership levels may have seen their funding recovery lag. So but that creates this variability in how much agencies are receiving. Yes.
Comment really for Director Zimmerman's benefit. So this formula has been in place since 2018. Just think about the volatility in transit. So I think the part of the challenge in all of this is there's never a normal year, right? And so I think I think what Nate's saying is absolutely indicative of sort of what's going on. But the other thing I think it's important, just because again, I was part of the group that had to figure this stuff out back in 2018, 2017, is while the operating cost is used, there was a lot of other things looked at, and it became a proxy for a lot of things. And so yes, it's input, but it tells a story of sort of the complexity of that system. And it kind of gets at that. If we're trying to get to things that are simpler, at that point, that is why operating costs were used, because it was a good way of saying, like, how big is this, the system in terms of ridership miles, all those things. And so I'm always a little sensitive because the label has been a tough one to work with because it's operating costs. Oh, we're going to benefit them for having an expensive transit. It's not quite like that, but I just know that there's many folks around the table really trying to figure out what are all the different metrics. And when we look across the whole Commonwealth, asking a little service system to provide a ton of data, a large system may already have, that became a proxy. And so I just want to kind of there's a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of several years in some of these things. They're not perfect at all. But that's one that always, it's a bit of a trigger for me. Everybody knows that, because it's not really the operating cost, but that becomes a proxy for a whole bunch of other things. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I want to talk through how the challenges were addressed in the previous scenarios that we looked at. So in terms of this input focus on costs and operating costs in particular, the approach was to consider weighting the outcome-focused metrics more heavily, which shifts the weights away from operating costs and more towards service metrics. And we're going to dive into each of these in a little more detail in a second. I've got some examples that sort of summarize how this plays out in the real world for actual agencies. The other is, next one was, in order to address incentivizing performance of all operators, to emphasize the operational efficiency, so that you're getting at their incentivizing their resource optimization. So the way we did that was by having a separate performance allocation rather than edging the sizing up and down. There's an actual allocation that's entirely based in a pool of funds that's entirely based on the performance of the agency. And note that portions of what sizing is based on are performance-based to some extent because you're accounting for the fact that ridership, vehicle revenue hours, and miles are part of the sizing formula. So there are some performance elements to the sizing calculation as it is. The complexity, so we looked at ways of making it more simple and transparent. The trend analysis shift to looking more at absolute performance is something we'll talk about in a second, which helps to simplify this. And then the annual variability, trying to find year-over-year predictability. There were approaches that we tested that tried to limit the swings year-over-year by putting some circuit breakers in place, either by limiting how much funding could go up or go down by year. What you'll see is that the scenarios that we present don't include anything to directly address annual variability, in part because that ran afoul of another objective of the formula, which was to incentivize performance. And the extent to which you put a circuit breaker on things then puts a brake on incentivizing performance, because an agency that's doing great things to really improve its performance, if you say your funds can only grow by 10% per year, then that's dampening how much they might be able to receive. And then an agency whose performance is dropping, conversely, might not, if you were putting a brake on how quickly their funds could fall, that would limit the incentivizing effects of making sure that they perform strongly. That was one we don't deal with in any of the scenarios that wound up moving forward as a proposal here, but was one of the things that we were initially looking at. Okay, so I'm going to delve into the first three in more detail. So the first one is thinking about how to create a more input-focused formula. So the challenge here with cost is that it does put at 50% of the sizing metric, it puts a strong weight on how much the agency cost is. And you could have a circumstance where an agency works to lower its costs in order to help manage its budget more effectively, but then would be penalized in terms of how much money they would receive in a future year, because if they're spending less, they might receive less in state funding. The other thing with cost, and this builds on Ms. Matthijs' comments a few minutes ago, are that cost is an important, what we learned through running scenarios was cost was an important proxy for the general cost structures of agencies, because these services are so different in terms of what it costs to operate them, a rural paratransit versus urban, local bus versus commuter bus. Light rail is part of this formula as well, and they all have very different cost structures. And the other thing is that there's variability in terms of what the cost is to operate service just regionally across the state. Costs in Northern Virginia are higher than the rest of the state. Costs in urban areas are higher than the non-urban areas of the state. So cost becomes an important proxy for those two things as well. So part of the attempt here was to retain cost because of the important elements that it represents, but also to minimize costs in terms of its weight in the formula. There is an example here from the city of Petersburg, and what was evident with some of their allocations was that they had the numbers that went into their allocations for FY25 versus FY26. So this would be FY23 and 24 data. They had similar levels of service that they were operating, but they found some ways to more efficiently operate that service and their costs went down. So even though they were operating similar levels of service, they had similar ridership. Because their cost went down, their allocation in 24 that was computed based on the portion of their formula was based on operating cost actually went down. So this is an example of an agency that did try to bring some efficiencies to the service. Their costs went down, and because their costs went down, their allocation went down as well.
How did they do in the performance side though?
On the performance side, they would have done better, but the performance side is kind of a rounding error to some extent in terms of how it affected, and they were more harmed by the changes on the sizing side of it than by the adjustments that might happen because of the performance adjustment.
So it was a net reduction.
It was a net reduction in how much the agency got in terms of state operating assistance. All right, so the performance trend basis, and we're going to talk, we have some graphics that help to, that we've seen before that helps tee this one up in a second. What you're currently being judged on for your performance trend is really the slope of your line and how your trend compares to the slope of the state's line. And the difference there is, are you improving at a rate at or above what the state's rate of improvement is? And that's what's really driving the performance adjustment is the slopes here. And page. So your trends are over a multi-year period as part of what you're looking at. And it's the rate of improvement that you're seeing as an agency. Now, what is sort of the issue here with that is that agencies can be improving, and you can have an agency that has a high rate of improvement, but may still be performing in a weak relative to the statewide average in absolute terms. And you can have an agency that's sort of perhaps capped out in its performance, but is a high performer in absolute terms relative to the statewide average. So by looking at an absolute measure, this would really take a look at how are agencies performing relative to the statewide average for a single point in time, as opposed to how do their trend, how does their slope of their improvements change over time. So it is looking more directly at their absolute level of performance rather than their trend in performance. The example here with this one, there's a couple that we can point to. One is Valley Metro in the Roanoke area, and what they were seeing was that they had pretty high absolute performance in cost efficiency versus the statewide average. They had relatively steady ridership, slightly increasing costs as an agency. But then their performance trend adjustment had a net negative impact on their allocation. So it was going down in 24, 25, and 26 in terms of the funding they received because their trend was not keeping pace with the statewide trend. So in absolute terms, they were improving, but their slope wasn't as steep as the state's slope. So they didn't perform as well in terms of their funding in the performance adjustments that happen in that portion of the equation. And we've seen some similar trends with Richmond, GRTC, where its performance has been relatively strong on a statewide basis in terms of its trend in revenue hours and miles of service relative to cost and its ridership relative to the cost. But not seeing the adjustment in its performance allocation because, again, its slope is not keeping pace with the state's slope in terms of how things are changing on a statewide basis.
Following up, if I could, Chair, on sort of case analogy on City of Petersburg, where they had a net reduction. This is performance, but what about the sizing? Did still Valley Metro go down?
Do you recall where the absolute amount went down in these cases? Are these
No,
percentages?
these percentages are absolute, these are the total allocation, not the sizing of the performance side. The actual allocation went down, 1.7 in between, I guess, 2003 and 4, 4.3 from 4 to 5 and 5 to 6, 9.
It's a whole thing.
It's
It's
the
just, even
whole-
though we're talking performance trend, the overall reduction in this case is net.
Yes, so this is the total amount that these agencies receive, that this agency, or Valley Metro received, went down by these percentages these years. And the reason we attributed that to this performance adjustment having an impact in terms of how much their funding was going down.
But I guess when we did it, we looked at both of them separately. I'll have to go back into the files to answer the question that you were asking.
Yeah.
What the impact, if there was any sort of movement on the sizing end as well, separate from performance.
But it seems that if I'm understanding this, the current model, your performance is based against that statewide trend analysis. The proposed change is taking that out, so you're just compared to yourself versus.
You're compared to the statewide absolute measure of, instead of being, so for one of the measures, say, go to the,
And it's just the absolute for that year.
yes.
Yes.
So we're not capturing any averaged over 3 years or so if.
Right. So if we're looking at, say, cost per revenue vehicle hours, it's based on what's your cost per revenue vehicle hour relative to the statewide average in absolute terms, as opposed to your number relative to the state trend over 3 years. There is a variation that was put forward for public comment that said, what if we use 3 years average data to make that adjustment as opposed to 1 year of data? So that's a variation that's been on the table, and I don't think that there's been a resolution of which path to go with on that. But setting that issue aside, it's taking the trend out and looking at it based on, is your cost per hour above or below the statewide average, and by how much, by what, index, as opposed to, is your slope in that measure rising at a rate that's above or below the statewide average.
And I think as we move forward, this was the one that nobody still understands.
Thank you.
So all the time that we want, look, you're doing great. Some of us, it takes a little, but I'll be honest, of all of this stuff, this is probably the one that people still are trying to catch what this actually means or whatever. So insofar when we move forward, this one's going to need to be brought down to sort of, elementary school level for all of us to really understand. Because I think that tripped out a lot of folks. They thought they understood, but then they, this is not easy.
And I think we just kind of found the principle of it was that you could be a poor performer, but still increasing and get rewarded, while people that are not a poor performer, but just sort of stable would be punished. I think that's the principle of the thing that showed to us. And it may have been because of COVID, because a lot of people saw a decrease and some came up faster than others, as was mentioned. And so, the trends just started to play a much bigger factor and didn't smooth things out like I think it was intended all the time. Obviously, having a 3-year average or performance trend should smooth things out, but it's just turned out to kind of, again, if you're stable and you're a good performer consistently, you may not benefit from this formula the way it is now due to just other not as good performers just increasing for whatever reason or another. So that's sort of the
Makes sense.
principle thing,
Literally the mechanics of
measures.
measures.
That's true. No, that's true.
Understand. Yeah.
You really have to see you'd have to see the work.
Right.
You got to see the work. Sorry, Marie.
Yeah, no, and I was just gonna say, I mean, I think stepping back of what's the goal that we are trying to get at this performance piece, and again, 1 hour into the job, right? But my sense is the current formula doesn't seem to be capturing what the goal is. And so how would we get at that? But I am also struck looking at some of this data, and I'm curious to hear from those of you who are running and with transit agencies. It's hard for me to imagine programming out if I see that much variability of, I've lost almost 10% of funding. that's a big cut that makes it hard for me just to do my business. So it also seems, while performance is important, some notion of stability, reliability, like just to be able to run an organization, how do we think about something that can maybe reduce that much of change and shift year
I
over
think that's a
year?
great point. That's where, this is the other part about the trend thing, is you're being compared to everybody else, and some could be increasing at a great rate for whatever reason. They're making changes and other people are just doing this. And so, again, those people that are just doing well consistently would see a reduction just because someone else is. And it's great for other people to make changes, but it can cause some swings in other folks.
I was gonna say, I mean, I just think of the example of whether you have a really bad weather event that shuts down a system, or you have a federal government shutdown that completely disrupts 6 weeks of transit. And then next year will be somebody else is affected. I think that's the harder thing about all this, is sort of, I'm not, performance stuff is very important, but again, how we grapple this, what's the big goal, and what's the predictability is something that we hear from transit systems. You've got to be able to budget because you know what you're looking forward to. And so these poor folks at Valley Metro, to see that all of a sudden, okay, maybe 1% down, but 9% down, like that's, we got to figure something out here if this is what we've got going on.
Well, we've emphasized that the big swings are going to be more demonstrated more in the sizing metric. I think but that just also means performance sort of also still just kicks you a little bit when you're down if you're experiencing that. So it's just it's a double whammy in some ways if you experience that.
Question about the absolute measure. So I know you mentioned that you're still trying to determine whether, if you moved in that direction, it would be based on a 1-year statewide average absolute performance, or like a 3-year average. Do you have any information about what the fluctuation in the average statewide absolute performance is year over year?
Yeah, I think we have that based on the scenarios that we've run.
We do. I mean, do you mean according to the current formula?
No, I'm just saying, like, the absolute, if we're not looking at a trend anymore, we're just talking about the absolute average statewide performance year over year. How much variability is there year over year, to consider whether just using 1 year would make more sense versus 3 years, if there's something that needs to be smoothed out there, if you're seeing, I assume that because there's so many agencies that are smaller, that are not improving as quickly as the large urban areas, that would probably bring down the average and make it somewhat stable, as opposed to seeing like a fluctuation in the statewide average going really high because the urban areas, everybody's going back to work, ridership is increasing, whereas in the rural areas, maybe that's not the case. But with the distribution of types of agencies across the state, I would think that statewide average would probably stay pretty stable. Is that what you guys have found to be true?
Well, it's also because the years that we were analyzing, it's also like it covers this COVID period. So again, when you say performance, there are 5 performance metrics in the current formula. So all of them, you can look at them individually. Passengers per revenue hour has declined. Passengers per revenue mile has also declined. I'm talking about statewide average. And this is, I know, 1 over, so it's the other way around. But
So
a general declining trend.
yeah, and I will say we did look at the sensitivity and the variability, because that was one of the things we knew was an issue for our transit agencies, is not necessarily knowing how much money they're going to get from year to year. And what we found was, and it's one of the reasons we said we didn't necessarily meet the goal of predictability, which was one of the things we had as a goal for the formula, is that, and I think we can pull this for the next meeting, but we did do sensitivity analysis to see like how the scenarios would swing with allocations using the 1 year and the 3-year average for absolute performance, and there's still swings. And so that's where we were trying to figure out, is there a way that we can get at this that would allow more predictability? And I think that gets back to, do we have a floor, or do we have some ceilings? And that may allow us to be able to bake in a little more predictability into the process. But that's one of the reasons, as we've talked through this, we've said, as much as we wanted to say, yes, we checked the box on predictability, we still didn't feel like we got there, even with this scenario. Go ahead, Dan.
Here, based on all the questions and comments, I would say this is definitely one of my 2 big ones for sure. Right. Because those scenarios and understanding this tied to some of these other changes and the new performance for me, I need to connect the dots. So
I mean,
putting a pin out there.
I think this is somewhere we could come back and look at some of the math and show it because, we agree. This is something it took a while. This is one of the
And this would
understanding
be
things.
stuff we need to get out before the next meeting and that for all our stakeholders
Yes.
behind us.
Yes.
So maybe breaking this apart for you all would be.
Yes.
They talked about, which is where Paula, I think, was sort of heading, is that other scenario out there where we would look at an average and absolute. I would.
And it's difficult to understand the abstract, absolutely.
Is there any possibility of thinking about we have a cap on how much state operating funding can be, 30%, right? Is there any thought about maybe putting a cap on how far you can fall in a given year?
We did that.
You did that.
I will say the math gets really complicated, so I know Grant and Dan are wanting to jump in.
Yeah, I guess to your point, Mr. Chair, the floor, we talked a lot about that. And I think the challenge was you can't technically implement a floor because we don't know how much money we're going to get. So like that, it kind of goes against code. Like, I guess the General Assembly could give us technically 20 million in 1 year and everybody goes past the floor. So it was hard in practice for us to conceptualize that. I guess what I wanted to mention is that if we're talking about predictability and like the concept that we're proposing here, 95% of the funds are determined in the sizing metric, 5% in the performance set aside. If we want predictability, we got to focus on the 95 and implementing the 3-year averages or whatever averages over there. That will really impact stability. If you're doing the stability stuff on the 5%, it's just going to around the edges. It's the sizing metric that drives everything. And it doesn't have to be all of the factors have to be, averages. It could just be cost, or it could just be ridership, hours, miles, whatever it is. But that's really, I think, where the focus needs to be if we want to make some improvements to predictability.
Here, that's the second big item I wanted on my list is a 95.5% split.
That's currently we're talking about even.
Yeah, that's also why I wanted to know if this was net or gross, because we're talking performance with 5%, but if you drop 10%.
Right, so I actually looked at the numbers. The sizing side volumetric changed much, at least between 5, 6, as in 25 allocation and 26 allocation. This decrease is basically.
It reinforces that we need to look at the 95 piece. And you were talking floor dollar amount. I wonder if 4%, like dropping 10% is, but if it was 3%.
Yeah, no,
What I was going to say was that I misspoke. We didn't try the floor. We tried a cap because of the reason that. But also, if we were looking at either a floor or a ceiling, would be on percentage growth, but the percent of nudge that the performance trend does to your sizing. So not over year, so those are two different percentages. There's year over year growth. There's also every year you calculate the size and then you nudge it up or down based on performance. So this one goes down 9.1%. The next slide has another agency that goes down 14%. So so that's sort of variation one could try where you could see what, if you could limit how much, but then again, then you're messing with performance to Nate's point earlier, and you're short circuiting the performance incentive. So it's sort of, you have a performance metric, but then you're also limiting it. So that's sort of the policy consideration you have to. Mr. Chair.
Right.
So I think a point of clarification, if I understand correctly, that might help we're discussing. The current formula, the sizing metric, spits out a number, and then the performance adjustment can adjust up or down from the sizing. Okay. The proposed formula, the 95% sizing metric is sort of the floor, and that 5% is going to be on top of.
Right.
So there's, okay, I think that's what I thought I understood, because that would help with some of the predictability is that the sizing in the proposed formula is going to establish a minimum
So you know what that minimum is.
Up to 30%.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you may not get the 5% if you're
Yeah.
already at the 30.
So, Mr. Chair, I do have a little bit of a provocative question. We've been doing this program for 7, 8 years. Have we seen transit agencies change their performance because of the performance measures? Because I think that is really, there's a lot of work that's going into this. Are we seeing the outcomes because of that? And maybe that's not a fair question for you, but is the juice worth the squeeze? I hope so, but I just want to, like, is that actually, it's only, if you can only get 30%, so you have all 70% coming from somewhere else, is the 30% or the 5% of the 30% or whatever actually changing the behavior of the transit systems in a way that you guys want?
I think, we have people doing things like system optimization plans. I don't know that you're seeing, and, certainly, and people have done things like zero fare and things like that to try to get ridership up. So, yeah, you're seeing, I think, people, but whether you're seeing the results yet can vary across agencies, but certainly, yeah, I know people are doing things like optimization plans or even
That's good. That's what you hear, right?
even expanding potentially just to get those performance gains.
And that's why, Mr. Chair, that's why HRT is doing our SOP, so we can potentially do better in merit. So, I think.
If everybody does the optimization plan, everybody does better. So anyway, I'm just.
Everything's relative. So all like our agencies are trying to position themselves better, and we're trying to give them advice about how they can position themselves better. The issue is that the way that the trend adjustment works, it's really hard to predict whether an increase for them will actually lead to a better outcome. And that's why the absolute metric was proposed. Whether that's a 1 year or a 3 year average, it would more clearly position agencies to do better in the formula than now, where it's the outcome is highly dependent on how the whole state is moving. And so you can have these year over year high performers that have a flat line across the top, and year over year poor performers that have a slight increase. The poor performer is going to do better in the formula. I mean, not necessarily, there's a lot of other things that go into it, but they'll be rewarded for their performance trend line. And so that's the whole point here. But I was going to reiterate what Grant was saying about the sizing metrics. Those catastrophic events that would lead to, you having to shut doors for a month would limit ridership hours, miles, and costs. And so really it's impacting the sizing metrics more than it is the rates on the performance side, which is they're all divided by something, right? So like if you're not providing as many miles and you don't have as many passengers, the rate will move up and down kind of as you're dividing them. On the sizing metric side, a catastrophic event could lead to a massive dip. And that's what we've seen when a small agency loses a key staff member. That sometimes cuts their operating costs in half for half of a year or a whole year. And that's difficult on the sizing side of this. So Grant mentioned it, an average on the sizing side could address that.
We should also note that the current sizing formula and the proposed sizing
right.
formula is all based on 1 year of data. So we're not using trends or multiple years for sizing under either approach. So that impact of a catastrophic impact could impact you now just as much as it could in the future.
I think that in general, like what Dan and Grant were saying, that there's two very different components we're looking at here. We're looking at performance and we're looking at sizing. And it might help to just focus on one element at a time and say, are we in agreement that this element works? And then think about the other pieces. And I may be new to the TSDAC, but I have been attending every meeting last year, so I've been following this along. And I think from my perspective, it makes sense to move away from the trend, regardless of what else happens in the other portions of the formula, because like Dan said, regardless of how much you're applying to performance, how much funding's available performance, under the current trend formula, you're not accomplishing that performance goal either way if you're doing really well, but you're not growing at the same rate as other agencies. So just my opinion would be that moving to an absolute would make sense regardless of what else we do with the rest of the formula, because that does get at the nature of the goal of trying to reward people for good performance, whether they're trending upward or they're staying high consistently.
I'll keep going. So This was another half hour. We did 3 slides this time. So performance trend is not faring well here. We'll keep forging on. So there was one more challenge to resolve that the approach took, and that had to do with the complexity of it. So the fact that you've got 4 sizing measures, you have 5 performance metrics, that you're basing it on 3-year trends, and you're looking at the trends in that as opposed to absolute measures. So that's some of the complex factors with the existing formula. So the ways that the proposed formula simplifies that is by using 4 sizing metrics that place 65% of the formula on outcome measures versus 50% in the current formula. So cost is 50% now, and the proposal is for it to go to 35%, which means that 65% of the formula would be based on outcome measures. So as a way of simplifying, the performance measures would shift by going from 5 to 3, 50% based on cost efficiency, 50% based on service efficiency, and looking at a clean performance set aside. So rather than nudging up your sizing allocation up or down based on your performance, it would be a separate set aside for that in the proposed formula. The other piece of this that isn't on the slide but is important to remember is that another simplification is that reiterative calculation would not be needed, because you make that split and you say this money goes to sizing, this money goes to performance. Anything that caps out over here goes over to the performance calculation. You do the numbers once and you don't keep recycling through the calculation to address that 30% cap. The example here with this one of an agency impacted by the current formula is Bay Aging. So it's an agency with a relatively large service area. And what we see there is that they've had consistent performance metrics despite its large service area, but their absolute performance is significantly below the statewide average. Their size weight went down because the statewide average trend was improving, but its metrics stayed flat. So in this case, no change in performance metrics still had a negative impact on its allocation with that particular example. So we would seek to address that through some changes to the formula by making it less complex. We're going to some of these topics that we talked about already, such as the trend versus absolute performance. We're going to revisit some of those in the next few slides. So hopefully that delving into that will help to answer some questions on that. There are limitations of the current review that we want to flag. Again, this is review for TSDAC, that there are limitations in the data that we have that's verified by DRPT and available for every agency across the state. There is, of course, more data that agencies are reporting to the National Transit Database, but only a subset of agencies in the state report to NTD directly and compute those statistics. And for the smaller agencies, DRPT needs to request it from those agencies and needs to sort of have its own collection approach to get the data from those agencies. So the potential data we've talked about that would be useful for considering further changes in the formula would be passenger miles traveled. This really gets at that question of a commuter bus passenger is on that bus for, one ride times 30 miles, which counts, which when passenger miles traveled would count as 30, compared to a local bus where you have 30 passengers who travel 1 mile each. In the current formula, they would count as 30 riders, or versus passenger miles traveled, they would count as 30 passenger miles traveled, the same as that 1 passenger mile traveled by a commuter bus ridership. So taking into account not just how many passengers you have, but how far they travel is important. But there's a lot of complexity in getting good data on that. Taking into account how much money agencies or localities are putting into their transit service is important to consider. Indiana uses this in its performance-based allocation approach. So one of the things we did as part of the study was a peer review of other states. What are they doing to do their funding allocation for transit operating assistance? Indiana was one of the few states that also has a performance-based approach, and the amount of local money that goes into transit is one of the factors that impacts how much the state then contributes to this. How you measure that is something to consider. And it also gets at the question here. We've heard comments at TSDAC from the public about what should be counted in terms of the funds people put into transit. Do you treat local tax revenue differently from what people pay in fares versus what might be paid for with student fare passes that are common at the universities, where you pay a fee for the semester and that gives you free use of the bus in that community for the year, for the semester. There's very different ways that different agencies go about providing locally derived income to support their transit service. And this would be looking at what those income streams are and how they compare and how they can be taken into account. The third potential data point is cost of living indices that account for regional variation in costs across Virginia. And that could be a mechanism here that could address this question of how we use operating costs as a proxy for cost of living. The good news here is DRPT is initiating a study to investigate this, but the results of that will not be available in time to support the timeframe we have to report on this by spring.
And you all may not know this, but that was one of my questions, like, when will that be available?
Yeah, so we put the RFP out. We have awarded it. We are hoping to kick that effort off in earnest in February. Based on the scope of work, we're anticipating by the end of this calendar year, starting to have a report that we can pull on data. I think we're going to need to put in some technology enhancements to be able to capture data. So there's probably additional work we'll need to do internally to make sure we're getting information and can scrub that information. So it will be a long endeavor, but we think a very useful one that will inform kind of our next 3-year review as we continue the process.
So clearly after this schedule for the CT.
Yes.
Is it intentional that we have not seen knowledge what the metrics of a highly performing system look like? We talk about it, but what is it? What? How do we know whether we're there or not? Even if you don't measure anything,
Well,
you ain't
I think we've got a very good indication of that, which is we know what's causing the agencies that cap out at 30% to do so. And it tends to be college towns where you have very high ridership, robust transit service. Because of the vagaries where Virginia college towns are, they tend to have a lower operating cost than some of the urban transit systems. So that's why there's very consistently 4 agencies or so that we see capping out at no more than 30% statewide funding each year. They are the ones that in absolute terms tend to have the strongest performance and don't get any more funding than that 30%.
But what are the metrics of stronger performance?
Vehicle revenue hours, more vehicles per revenue hour, more riders per revenue mile, things like that. Yeah, so that's what, say, Blacksburg has their full buses. You've seen those certainly going around. And so that's, and Alexander Dash is another one, I think, with their sort of limited geographic area, but frequency.
Yeah, I would just say Blacksburg is not the metric that you want to compare everyone else to.
Hey, we've gotten somewhere in this meeting. All right.
We did a strategic plan, and the consultant, her eyes bugged out at some of the metrics because she was used to looking at light rail numbers metrics at 120 per revenue hour, passengers per revenue hour. So again, it's not, but I mean, I think that can tell you what the high end is, but I don't think that's the metric that you need to be comparing the statewide
How do we know whether we're doing well or not? I understand exactly what you're saying. That's not what we're trying to be, not what we can be.
And I think that's the challenge that we've had is that we have 40 different transit systems serving fundamentally. We talked about Dash or like you've got the college folks, you got Dash and Alexander, you've got super concentrated geography. And then you have, you know, folks that are more rural. Like
Aging.
and I think that's been the challenge the whole time is like, what's a set of metrics that goes from the 2 buses that are making sure folks can get to the Walmart to the, you know, urban center or college town, which I think is a great example where you have a captive audience. And that's, I think that's like the essence of our challenge is how do you do both of those? Or
No,
all-
it initially bothered me, and then I decided, see if y'all agree with this, that heck, can't do this. We can't put any relative merit on the need that's being met for the user. And we would all probably agree that the person is living in a life or death situation like having to go to dialysis. They have no other way to get there. It is a greater need than the person who's going to the movies. But we can't play in that space. We have no way to assess need, even define need. Right?
Not in terms of the riders. I think the one thing the current sizing measures do get at is not just who rides the system, which is where ridership is one of the current measures, but also how much service are you putting on the street? And that's why revenue vehicle hours and miles of service is important so that you're recognizing that the extent to which a community is providing transit service, it's addressing the needs of the community and the theory that more service is better in terms of providing more access within the community.
If I may add to this, just to put it in a little bit different terms, I don't think there is one performance metric out there that defines good performance for all agencies. They all have different goals. They all have different service areas, different things they're aiming at. For one agency, it could be providing lifeline service to people that live in rural areas. For another, it's about getting 120 people on light rail. And so because of that, this formula has decided that there's 5 metrics that the state sees as good performance versus bad performance. Whether that's correct and applicable to all agencies is up for debate at all times. But it makes it very hard for us to sit here and say objectively, this is the one metric that every agency needs to aim at. So we've landed on these 5 as things that everybody's looking at in different ways, but would put some people at a disadvantage compared to others. Just
What are
based
the
on
5?
Oh, the 5 that we have are riders per hour, riders per mile, cost per hour, cost per mile, and cost per passenger. Those are the 5 that are highlighted in the.
And as you said, that could vary greatly given the circumstances in which the operation is happening.
Exactly. And so what an individual agency's goals for all 5 of those may not be in line with maximizing each one of those. And so that's why it becomes difficult to do this across 38 agencies and of all different scopes of service.
It's kind of like, rest just a second, the smart scale, where most rural locations are greatly disadvantaged because they don't have congestion.
Certainly.
Yeah, well, that's good or bad, you know, one could sit here the rest of the day and discuss that.
Yeah.
But that's the way it is.
Certainly. And
That's why we need to have more than one, but also simplify it. Because some people are going to be stronger or weaker than the others. It gets back to, it's a proxy. We're
Like, no, to add, it's basically because you're comparing, whether you take 1 year or the trend, you're comparing it to statewide average. So no agency, the agencies aren't being compared to each other, but to statewide average. And then the hope is that the average averages everybody out. So.
And to the question of which performance measures are we looking at here, we have some graphics that summarize the change from the current 5 to the proposed 3 to delve into that more detail. So the data is important, and we're working through that. But the limitation in the current study is that the 4 items that are on the top are what we have available to us to work through. So that's a key limitation of this current round of analysis. Another thing, if we could go.
I think Brian had a quick question.
is this study going to come out with like recommendations of maybe how to implement this data?
Yeah, I think the goal of the study is to find out what we can collect. We've got to think through how we're going to collect it and then have recommendations on which ones we'd want to implement in the formula, what the drawbacks are, because obviously some will have drawbacks depending on how they're implemented. So that's the goal.
And I guess this question, would this report to review it?
Absolutely. Yep, we'll share it.
Okay, so another clarification here. These are some conceptual clarifications to make, and some of these we've talked through already. So we'll reiterate quickly here and ask answer questions if you have them. We talked about how trend analysis is not the same as an average. So a trend is how your year-over-year growth creates a slope, and trend is about what that slope of the line looks like, as opposed to an average, which is saying your amount was this number this year, this number this year, this number that year, and how that averages out over time. Average is a slope of the line that connects the dots of those three numbers. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. The other thing is there is a perception that the existing formula is 100% performance-based, but it's not exactly accurate, because most of the funding that agencies are currently receiving is by and large based on their sizing. And that from our analysis of the numbers, roughly 95% of what agencies are currently getting today is based on the sizing metrics. But what we do to the sizing is make some adjustments to it based on performance. And we see some of the trends in terms of how agencies' allocations change in unusual ways based on how their performance relates to the statewide average, which is what we talked about with those examples we just talked about with GRTC, Valley Metro, Bay Aging, and Alta Vista is another one. Where it saw a reduction in funding of 14% as a result of some changes in performance. So the 5% set aside and reconfiguring the formula so that a specific bucket of funds is set aside for performance would create some bookends on how much agencies receive on a performance basis, and would help to avoid some of the swings of the size weight that can happen, because the size weight would stand alone for roughly 95% of the funding that's being allocated, and rather than having your size weight shifted up or down, it's based almost entirely on sizing, and then you're using the performance measures to allocate this remaining amount of funding to agencies. So, yeah.
Sometimes a little bit, I think one of the things which I mentioned before, and it may flow into another part of the presentation, is right now is 5% performance. And I remember during one of our earlier meetings, you talked about, you did some sensitivity. What if it went higher or low? I still, I need to understand that.
Why we wouldn't make the performance set aside 10%, for instance. Yeah, I think Nate we had talked about that earlier. So yeah. I don't, if you recall.
We do have graphics that demonstrate that we can share again. And the bottom line was that if you made the performance basis much higher than 5%, it started to distort the allocations to the agencies so that they began to get divorced from sizing in ways that didn't make sense. Yeah. And you saw smaller agencies getting a lot more money because they were strong performers, but they need that to the extent that you were emphasizing that by shifting to a 10 or 15% set aside for performance versus the 5 that was part of the recommended scenario.
So they can make it more
spending
performance.
all these time on this also may be like a question we want to do, but like, why should we change anything right now until the next study is done? Like we're nipping at the edges and having unintended consequences, or the law changes, or maybe there's more money, because you all know I don't like changing the slices of the pie when the pie stays the same. Anyway, I'll just throw that out for now. I'm not sure we're there, but it's a lot of work and having unintended consequences without some new data, some new proxy info.
I will say to that point, Cindy, I hear you and I agree, and I think we can continue to talk about it, but I do think staff feel like some of these changes are really needed and warranted just because it makes the administration of the program difficult. It's hard for our transit agencies to understand how they can impact and influence their performance in the process. And the trends alone just really create this complexity and these strange anomalies in the formula that are not working the way we had anticipated. So I think that's why we really feel like, maybe we don't make all the changes, but some of these, like the trends, are things that we really feel strongly about just on our side of the house could be benefits as we move through this process.
So a pin for.
Maybe,
for
yeah.
anyone?
Right.
February.
Yeah, I guess I'd say we've seen a couple of instances where it's pretty clear that there are dysfunctional aspects of this, and even if it only lasts for 2 or 3 years, at least we'd have a comparison basis to look at. So that may not be the best justification for it, but there may be a couple of things.
Throwing
we
it
can-
all out, we can
Right.
do something.
Yep.
I just want to have us open conversation
Yep.
on that.
Any other comments before we go on?
One thing I'll add to the data study is just when the data study is done, doesn't necessarily mean that that's when we're going to be able to put it into effect. Because we may need to collect multiple years of that data, and we may need to deploy capital enhancements to do that. And so it could be 3 years before we can really get to implementing that into a formula. Depending on what it is. I mean, we're looking at everything under the sun.
And the transit operators would need to actually be able to collect the data as well.
Right.
So, yeah, I totally get all that.
Training and everything.
And a lot of people be affected by the massive increases in funding for transit.
Exactly.
That's right. And I will say we are complying with state codes, because we are to review this every 3 years. I'm going to say we have to change it every 3 years. As John and I know, since 2013. Here, my little rant.
So we talked about the difference between 1 year of performance data versus the 3-year trend earlier. So this table helps to summarize, and I think the color is a little bit hard to see here on the screen in the room, but it does where does one benefit the other? That coloring. So with 1 year of performance data, this one's pink and these two are green, meaning there's a little bit of a more positive impact of using 1 year for these two. And the reverse is true for 3 years, where these two are pink and that one's green. So with 1 year of performance data, there's a more significant impact of a catastrophic event to your performance measures in a single year, where the 3-year average would help smooth that out. But as we were talking about earlier, that catastrophic event where all your service levels drop because of some sort of a weather or government shutdown or whatever event, the current approach and the proposed approach is that you would continue to use 1 year of data for the sizing metric. So that piece of it is important to keep in mind, because that's how 95% of the funding is allocated. So that's the same under any approach. When we talk about the 3-year average, it's really just within the context of the performance data. So it would help to smooth that out within the performance allocation. But then the next calculation, or the next, these are really kind of the obverse of each other here, the first 2 rows. The last one is really getting at the fact that the 1 year of performance data helps to provide a greater emphasis on performance and helping to make sure that a change today to help improve performance leads to new funding in 2 years when your data from today is used to apply to your funding. It'll take 3 years for the impact of that improvement to make its way through the formula if you shift to a 3-year average. So that's why that's impact is sort of colored more negatively for the 3-year performance data. The other thing to keep in mind is that fewer metrics does not make it less performance-based. It just simplifies the number of metrics that would be the basis for that allocation. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the evaluation process and the scenarios tested. So this is where we jump into the scenarios first here.
That's a good question, and I didn't know if it's had a chance to come up on the operating costs. How do fares, people doing fare free, people doing different fare structures, like how is the role of how a transit agency approaches fares play into any of this?
Not at all, right?
Okay.
Except to the extent that it might incentivize ridership in some way, and that's one of the measures that's part of the.
So it's not pulled out, it's not.
Well, no, I know the one.
Folks are confused about this.
The one where they have a grant from a, and they're getting fares, and when they're getting reimbursed, they're having to take off the fare income in their reimbursement request. That's just that's different. Yeah, so, again, it's not included here. That's just not included here at all. That all goes into operating costs and everything else. Like it's just out there. Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah.
So if somebody uses, the university pays for the fares, or the city pays for the fares, or transit benefits pays for the fares, that has absolutely no role in the amount of money that they may get. Good, no,
we're not getting that deep into it right now. Yeah, if it was reflected somewhere in the financials but it doesn't.
Thank you.
Because the revenues they get from those sources, they spend. It's part of the expenses. And that's what's captured in all of our metrics.
Thank you.
But in a hypothetical, if an agency wants to go zero fare and there isn't a subsidy to offset the fare revenues, and they've reduced service in order to become fare free, which I know nobody, I don't think, has really done, but in that model, then they are impacted because their budget goes down and their expenses go down.
Okay. Thank you.
We had a method to our madness here, which you see in this slide here, that I know TSDAC has seen before, that we start with the data we have available to apply in the formula. We developed more than 30 scenarios to look at different elements of how the formula changed, and how we could tweak the existing formula in different ways to address the issues that were identified that we've been talking about through the morning portion of our discussion. And we did different combinations of that. Sometimes we were changing things in isolation. Sometimes we were doing it in combination to try to isolate what happens if we change it. So then earlier, what happens if you just change performance separate from sizing? We did that. We have scenarios that looked at that. So so we can isolate the various impacts here. We were looking at how the scenarios penciled out in terms of the impacts of each of them. There was a lot of sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what would stick. So of these 30 scenarios, there were a lot that, conceptually it made sense to test it, but the results, for whatever reason, were a garbage result. So, those are quickly dismissed, and we move on to the ones that sort of give us sensible results. And those are the ones that then became the basis of what gets presented to TSDAC. So worked with DRPT staff to shortlist that list, and then evaluated those promising scenarios and looked at how then the results would pencil out using historic data from FY24 through 26 to see if these new formulas were in effect. What would the actual results be for agencies receiving funds under them? So this is a summary of the scenarios that we tested and the approach to revising those scenarios. So on the left, you can see the different tweaks that we made, adjusting the size weight, eliminating the iteration, revising the performance base allocation, introducing the performance set aside, adjusting the funding caps, and then some combination of that. And you can see how many we did of each of those. Really, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows were done in isolation. They were each designed to address one or more objective, which you see in the third column there. And, where we really focused on was how do these in combination with each other give us a meaningful change in the formula, which is where there were various combinations of the above that were more than 15 of the scenarios that were evaluated. So over 35 scenarios evaluated in total. All of the results from the scenarios that we prepared have been released as a spreadsheet on the TSDAC website, so they are available for public review, in addition to the ones that we delve into in some detail and with graphics here in these presentations. So another question that we got from TSDAC was, how did the formulas evolve over time, and what were some of the permutations that had the most promise? So I'll walk through that here just a little bit, and I will note too that there's an appendix in the back of the deck that shows the iteration over time of these from meeting to meeting, because there were different results presented at the July and August, and then the couple meetings we had in the fall and the webinar. So we go through that history of which scenarios were presented when at past TSDAC meetings in the appendix. This doesn't go date by date. It just sort of hits the highlights and what the various assumptions were about these scenarios. So the top row is the proposed formula. That's what we're going to be talking about in more detail here, is what is the formula that is on the table right now as a proposed approach. The various elements of this that vary across these scenarios are the sizing weights, the performance basis, and then some of them have some other feature that might change. So in this proposed formula, one of the features of it is that we're looking at 1 year of performance data. Okay, so the other scenarios make some changes to that. And you can see, if this is the proposed formula in the first row, you can see how these other scenarios pivot from that in different ways. So this next row here, the change is that it uses 3-year average performance, a 3-year average for performance data instead of 1 year of performance data. These first two scenarios were the ones that were presented for comment in the request for comment that was circulated by DRPT in the fall. The next row down, the tweak there was that the performance basis percentages were different. There was another scenario that incorporated basically the same as the proposed formula, but also made the administrative changes. So you can see how the administrative changes result in changes to what gets allocated. There was another scenario we did that just did sizing adjustments and made an adjustment in the trend. There was one that combined sizing and performance and had a different sizing weight than the proposed scenario. So at one point we were looking at 40% cost, 40% ridership, 10% hours, 10% miles. There was another scenario that took cost out of sizing entirely. And so it was 60% based on passengers, 20% hours, 20% miles, and maintained the existing trend adjustment. Let's see, there was another scenario that made all sorts of changes. So it was looking at a 50-30-10-10 split, which is comparable to the existing formula. There was a trend adjustment plus an additional step for an absolute performance. So we were kind of looking at what if you kept, this was probably the most complex of all the formulas we looked at. What if you kept the existing performance allocation plus you had this special distribution of the remainder of funds that are available after agencies that cap out at 30%, and you use the proposed performance evaluation approach for that. That made things even more complex because then you have two different performance allocation approaches. Again, some of this was not necessarily to say, well, this sounds like it would be a great scenario. Let's look at it. It was more to see what happens if we go down this route so we can understand some of the dynamics of play between these results here. And then there was another one that looked at capping the funding growth. So it was very similar to the existing formula, except it capped your funding growth at 10% over your prior year. So these are, key scenarios that were developed, documented. The appendix provides the guide to where these were presented at past TSDAC meetings, and we also have for some of these that are towards the top of the table that kind of were the ones that were looked at later in the process in the fall. There's summaries of those in an appendix in the back of that for today's meeting. I'm going to let me pause before I move on from that. Any questions about the various scenarios that were investigated? Yes.
It's just, so obviously we're starting from 50% sizing. That's what it's currently right now, 50, 30, 10, 10, right?
That's right.
What was the discussion that brought it to 35, 15, 15?
There was a scenario you can see here where we were looking at 40, 10, 10 at one point, and it was more of a theoretical argument that the formula should be roughly based on a third based on cost, a third based on ridership, and about a third based on service provided.
Okay.
It doesn't work out. We didn't want to do like odd percentages, so we rounded to the nearest 5% just to keep things straightforward, which meant that
35,
you got 35, 35, 15, 15, which of course these hours and miles together add up to 30%. So it's slightly less for the service you're providing in favor of slightly more for cost and estimates.
And Nate, I mean, just when our discussions, we appreciate what sizing was doing. Nate would say, shows how much service you have out there as well as operating costs. So again, we went any lower than that on the sizing side. It really started to break that link, like you said before. So that was part of it too. We felt like 35 was meeting where we wanted to make it somewhat less income input focused, but not break the whole chain there. So that was just, that was a discussion.
So we'll delve more into this proposed formula. Oops, a little bit more detail here. So going back again to basics in terms of what are we trying to accomplish here from a big picture's perspective. Policy goal, deliver the most value and best outcomes to our customers as efficiently as possible. So the three objectives that we talked through in detail earlier that we're seeking to accomplish through this particular formula is focusing on outcome-based metrics, providing some simplification and transparency, and promoting operational efficiency. And you can see how the features of the proposed approach do that. So with respect to focusing on outcome, we do that by focusing on ridership, hours, and miles to a greater extent than the current formula. Less emphasis on cost, but still retaining cost to reflect those regional and modal differences in cost structures. To simplify and make more transparent, there's that set aside of funding up front for the performance basis. So rather than making an adjustment to the sizing based on performance, you're basically siphoning off a set of funds that are allocated entirely on a performance basis, removing the iterative calculations where we've got to go back through and there's money out left on the table after we cap out agencies at 30%. Let's run the formula again. Oh, still money on the table. Let's run the formula again. So we eliminate that iteration with this approach. And we used a single year of performance data here as the basis for this formula. And then to support operational efficiency, it's looking at combining sizing and performance incentives to maximize resource use. So probably not that different than how the existing formula works, but the fact that you've got both sizing and performance incentives built into the formula helps to promote operational efficiency. Our feeling is, though, that the proposed approach addresses some of the shortcomings with how the current formula incentivizes because of what we talked about with the specific examples earlier. So this addressed 3 of the 4 objectives. I think the one that we had trouble addressing in any meaningful way when you started to talk about combining factors was predictability. So the predictability piece is the one that is the 4th that's not directly addressed through this particular approach. Yes.
If the goal is most value and best outcomes, what are the metrics that inform whether we're meeting the goal or not?
I think it's a theory of whether the formulas, the basis for the formula is aligning with supporting customers as best as possible. So it's based on which factors become the basis for how the funds are allocated, and are those factors ones that would drive agencies to support those objectives.
Can I go to the next slide? It shows the actual metrics.
Yep.
These are the metrics used.
So, right, so we can see here how the formula would change. And we're going to go through each of these in detail. So earlier, and if you've got the printout there, I think it's slide 29 has the current formula. If you want to have that one at the ready to compare how things compare to the. But the proposed formula, as we've discussed at past meetings, makes a pool of available operating assistance at the top here. So those are the funds that come from the Commonwealth by formula, the way that all the funds trickle down to the various transportation uses. And a portion of that by formula is available for operating assistance. Then where this takes that pool of funds available and it makes a fundamental shift is that 95% of the money goes into sizing and 5% goes into step backs for the performance allocation. Old approach, everything went to sizing, and then the performance allocation was an adjustment to the agency's sizing amount. And to the extent that an agency capped out at 30%, you ran the formula again. You ran it again until you had no more allocations left over from the agencies capping out at 30%. The new sizing metric, as we've talked about, shifts operating costs from 50% down to 35%, but then it expands ridership to become 35% and then hours and miles at 15% each. And then it simplifies the performance set aside to use 3 measures. So 2 are 50% of it is based on passengers carried per cost. So it's a matter of cost efficiency. And then 50% is based on a measure of service efficiencies, passengers carried per revenue hour and revenue mile. So 25% each. The reason you use both of those, hours and miles, and not just one or the other, is because certain agencies will perform differently. Some may be strong performers with respect to the hours that they operate. Some may be based on miles. So for example, a rural agency that carries passengers over a very long distance and at high speeds on rural roads might have greater performance by mile than by hour, and it would be flipped for an urban agency. So that's why both measures are important here to get at efficiency, service efficiency. And we're going to delve into this in more detail and compare the two to each other. So focusing in first on that step 1, the sizing. Here we see the shift from the current formula. There's operating cost goes from 50 to 35%. Ridership goes from 30 to 35%. So it increases a little bit. Hours and miles increase by 5 percentage points each to be combined about a third of the sizing allocation. It's the same metrics that we're currently using. Operating cost is still in here because of the fact that it's that proxy for service type and geographic location. We've adjusted the weights to reflect the relative priorities here, to de-emphasize operating costs to some extent. And 95% of the funding gets allocated this way without any sort of adjustment to it after the fact, except for the agencies that cap out at 30%. So, you know, most of the money that agencies are going to receive is based on, you know, your share of the statewide, your operating cost relative to the statewide share, your ridership, your hours and miles, and it's a straight proportion of those measures to allocate the lion's share of money under this formula.
Chair, if I may, just because I had this conversation during the lunch break, just to make sure I remembered it right, and everybody watching also. This is still 1 year.
This is 1 year of data. This is
Data.
not the 3-year
No
average of
average, no
data.
allocation, so that hasn't changed. And the denominators, besides the percentage changes, the denominators have changed for the proposed, for the,
On the performance side. So this sizing formula doesn't have any denominators.
okay, so it's just on the performance.
Other questions, comments?
Okay, so we'll shift to the performance adjustment. And as you know, we discussed earlier this morning, this is the more complicated piece of it. In that we shift from, first of all, instead of adjusting the sizing based on these factors, we instead take 5% of the money plus whatever's available after agencies cap out at 30%. So reality, it ends up being a little bit more than 5% of the money that gets allocated this way because the capped out funds are also part of this pool. And we allocate based on the agency's absolute performance relative to the statewide average for these metrics: passengers per divided by cost, passengers divided by hours, passengers divided by miles. This particular scenario uses a single year of data, which was alternative 1 that was sent out for comments to TSDAC. And there is the alternate approach that was part of the package. It's part of the deck here that looks at what the results might be if you were to use a 3-year average of data. And this is the part of the formula where the 3-year average would figure in. The other key change, and we'll show this graphically in a second with a diagram. The previous weighting and allocation was based on a trend approach. So it was based on how does your trend in each of these individual measures compared to the statewide trend. In other words, is your slope increasing more steeply than the statewide trend or not? And this is just based on an absolute index of your average. Are you higher than the statewide average for each of these measures or not for a 1 year of given data?
Just, and this is really for, again, because I know we got a couple newer folks or whatever, the 30% cap. The 30% cap is not legislated. That 30% cap is a policy decision that was made by DRBT and whatever. Just again, if there are changes in the legislation, the maxing out, that 30% is also a policy decision, just like everything else we're doing here. Okay. Just
That's right. Yeah, so for example, if there were to be some action by the General Assembly that would significantly increase funding for transit operating assistance, you would probably need to adjust this because the rising tide would lift all boats and we don't want everybody tethered to the old dock line. You know, we would need to allow for people to receive more money than they currently get.
I just want folks to understand it's a policy, not a law that has the 30% cap.
Add to that, all of these are policy, not.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, no. That's why we're here.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think going back to this, I mean, this is the part that's in law, right? And it's everything downstream of this pool that you're working with up here.
Sure.
That's all part of the policy.
And then a statement that says it's essentially.
And I know I've seen this, but how many agencies hit the 30%?
It's only anywhere from 4 to 6 a year.
4 to 6 years.
Can depend, but it's a handful.
All right, so we talked about the trend adjustment versus direct performance measurement earlier in the example we were looking at with Valley Metro. So but we've seen this slide before as a group, so we did want to reiterate it here to note the difference between the two. So on the left-hand side, the way the current performance adjustment work is a trend adjustment. So you're comparing yourself to whether your agency's trend is a greater or less than the statewide trend. So in this simple example here, we have a statewide average in blue, and then we have two agencies that are graphed here, Agency A and Agency B. Now, in reality, you have about 40 agencies that would form the basis for the statewide average, and a lot of them are going to be clustered right around the statewide average, but there's going to be some outliers on the low end and on the high end. For simplification purposes, we're just sort of choosing to show how two agencies might compare to that statewide average. So in the case of Agency A, it's got a negative trend. When you look at this line and where it starts from here and where it ends over there, it's pretty flat to declining just a little bit compared to the statewide average. Okay, even the fact that this line is relatively flat here, it's flat and it's not going up, and the statewide average is going like this. So therefore, the index of this slope to this slope means that this Agency A is going to have its funding nudged down under the current. Its performance adjustment will go down because its trend is not as good as the statewide average trend. Now, Agency B, its trend is upward. Its line is like this when the statewide average is like that. So the fact that its slope has a larger number than the statewide average means that it's going to see more funding coming to it, that the performance adjustment is going to mean that the amount you get allocated for sizing is going to have more added to it because of this particular trend here with this particular measure. What we're talking about shifting to, and we'll move to the other side, is the direct performance measurement, because this is about how an agency's performance is directly comparing to the statewide average number. So Agency A would see a higher share of performance set aside because it is, above the statewide average, and Agency B would see less because it's below the statewide average. So it sort of flips the results here because their performance relative to the statewide average is being recognized in absolute terms for that single year, rather than looking at what the trend in their performance is over time. Furthermore, this would be allocated based on taking that 5% plus the remainder. That smaller pool is what becomes the basis for what gets allocated as a performance adjustment. The 95% of the money that gets allocated based on sizing, that stands alone based on an agency's own sizing number. So that's off to the side and is distinct from what's happening with this in this particular example. If you were to move to a 3-year average rather than a single 1 year, then what you'd be looking at is, where is this line here over 3 years? And it's there, since they're pretty flat, their 3-year average number is going to be about right where the 1 year number is. For this agency here, their 3-year average is probably going to be right about, where this number is. So their 3-year average might actually be a little lower than their 1 year number would be, because they have an improving trend, and you'd be taking, years into account where they were doing worse than the statewide average. Now, for another agency, maybe they have a trend that's like that, and using a 3-year trend would help them because using a 3-year average would help them because their number was going down. So it all depends on what an individual agency is seeing relative to the statewide average here. Let me just pause, see if there's any questions about that.
Okay, so I was looking at slide 74, which is the scatter plot, which is using more than just your examples here. And I think what I said is 24, 25, 26 are the years.
Yeah.
That one's then here. So the way you described it just for those two examples, could you maybe just for me give an example how it showed on this scatter chart for 1 versus 3-year average? Because we were just kind of approximating on that slide.
Yeah, do you want to just type in 7.4 enter? We'll take us right to 74.
Thank you. I was grateful for all these appendixes. Thank you.
Scroll down and
Gotcha.
click on
Alright.
74.
Around 48, just so we know.
Or from the slide.
The current slide.
Whoa!
No.
I had to hit the wrong one.
So do you want to restate your question here with that up for all of us?
Yeah, so on the slide 48, you were just showing 2 examples. This is sort of the current universe for FY 24, 25, and 26, comparing the 1 and 3. So I was just going to ask you to kind of walk through, pick 1 or 2. What's the difference versus when you're on the other slide, you're going, here's the 1 year, and if it was 3, it's probably here. Now we have some
Well,
data.
so what this is showing is the dots, the blue dots are what agencies would be receiving if they were based entirely on just a single year of performance. And the orange dots show what would happen if you were to use a 3-year average instead of a single year. So in neither case are we using trends. And in each case, we're comparing what the agency would get under the new formula compared to what the existing formula would do. So for FXB Go here, blue is the difference between what they would get under the current formula and what they would get under a new formula that uses a single year of data. The orange is what they would get different if you were to use a 3-year average relative to the current formula. So what you see is that there's differences in what some agencies how they would perform using a single year versus a 3-year. So FXB Go, for example, it actually sees its funding go down a little bit. And that's true of all these agencies that were sort of lagging in terms of how much money they would get under the proposed formula compared to the existing formula, is that their performance in blue with a single year actually is stronger than it would be using a 3-year average. We have to look at the data to make certain of why that's happening. What I think is probably happening, just knowing that these are, FXB Go, PRTC, and Fairfax Connector, 3 agencies that are operating in the I-95 corridor and have seen quite a bit of recovery in ridership as COVID recoveries have occurred. That's probably the fact that they've had stronger performance in their most recent year than over the 3-year period, which is why they do better. And then the agencies that are sort of in the upper quadrant here, not as significant of a difference. Their orange and their blue dots are not as far apart from each other. But in most cases, we see that these agencies do a little better for the most part with a 3-year average than they do with a single year point of data. So the ones that are circled here are, most of you are in the room, HRT, GRTC Richmond, Valley Metro, Lynchburg, CSPDC. So their 3-year average in here, 4 of the 6 that are called out did better under the 3-year average than they did under the single year average. The ones that do a little better under the single year are CSPDC and just barely Arlington. So probably a reverse instance in that case where they may have had stronger performance relative to the statewide average in earlier years. And now these other agencies are sort of catching up. So the most recent year of data isn't quite as strong for them as the 3-year average would have been.
Thank you for the visualization and walking it through, because I think it helps us to see the impact.
Question. We won't tell names and stories both here, but there's a certain transit system in the state that is considering stopping all Sunday service. Let's assume, which I suspect is right, they carry a lot fewer riders on Sunday than on other days. That action, which would serve to probably modestly reduce the number of riders, but would probably increase riders per mile system. Is that going to likely result in more money or less money from the state?
So in the sizing portion of the calculation, they would probably see less ridership. They would have fewer hours and miles of service. So if that's 2/3 of the sizing formula, then 2/3, then that's likely to go down, which means that for at least 2/3 of the formula, they would probably see less money. The piece that's a question mark in my mind is, how does operating costs play in? Are they spending the money that they spend on Sunday service on the other days of the week, or are they just not spending it at all?
Just not spending it.
If they're not spending it at all, then their sizing goes down too, and they would get less money overall. If they're redeploying it to other days of the week and they're spending the same amount, then it's a wash, whether you spend that money on Sunday or the other days, as long as they're still spending it. That's on the sizing side of things. On the performance side, we could go back to 48. Performance side, what they're going to see is, their passengers per cost. Maybe that goes up a little bit because they're focusing on the more productive days of the week. And their passengers per hour and mile perhaps go up too, because again, if they've got stronger ridership Monday through Friday and Saturdays, then relative to the reduction and the fact that, you're cutting the things that are your denominators here, your cost, your hours, your miles. So they're probably going to do better from a performance point of view, but that's only 5% of what the allocation is based on. 95% is going to be based on this stuff. And they're not going to perform as well there. So overall, I would expect that agency to see a net loss in funding. But with so much of this stuff, you got to kind of run the numbers in reality to see how it actually pencils out.
And just to confirm, without going back to the other slide, when we ran that, that was the current data we had. And based on the timeline and audited financials and everything else, all the work we're doing now is on existing data. There's no new data that we're going to replay this out.
Right.
So everybody's consistently with existing data. I just sort of wanted to confirm that while we're doing this now, between now and April, no new data is available. Listen, that was one of the things we had sort of hoped.
The FY20 draft SIP will be out sometime in mid-April, at which point we'll have the FY27 run of the operating formula. But we can't really incorporate any of that until the end of April. And that would be the earliest. And then we'd have to have our whole team plug the numbers in and run them. And so at this point, we don't have those numbers.
And I think I know, as I mentioned before, at least as I focus on sort of the Northern Virginia space, return to work is huge this year. The data that's being used here doesn't represent it. So it becomes a little bit of a squishy. I know there seems to be a perspective like that Northern Virginia gets ruined by this formula. We may or may not. I don't know. So, but that's part of the challenge. I know I've realized, like, when's the data? When's the data? When's the data? Not till like April.
It all depends on when we're comfortable releasing it and putting it in. Generally, it goes with the release of the draft SIP.
Yep.
So I will say we are obviously, the RPT has to, TSDAC has to comply with the existing CTP resolution. I would love it if it went back to not fun.
That was the June 30th that we put in.
Administration and the current CTP.
To put a fine point on this, the wrinkle here is that another year's worth of data becomes available at some point in April, but we don't have, that list of additional data we'd like to have. None of that's available until the end of the year at the earliest, and then depends on how long it takes to implement collection of it.
So what we'd have is more updated data on what the impacts of the proposed changes would be, and or considering something like that 1 year versus 3 year.
current data that we're already.
Let's see. So the other piece of this that we've already kind of talked about is step 3 of the existing formula where you redistribute the funds for the agencies that cap out. You run the whole formula over again. That instead goes into the pot that's distributed by formula. So we don't have to do the iterative calculation here. So that's a key change here that simplifies things to avoid those multiple iterations.
Do you know what the financial impact is on that?
Financial impact in what way? In terms
Well,
of-
just sort of like administratively, I get this, but then is that, would we see a fundamental change in the potential of what?
There becomes a little bit more available for agencies to receive for performance when you do it this way, because that 5%, I think we looked at it varied by year, but I think it was anywhere from 2 to 3% or so that of the total amount of money you have to allocate, about 2 or 3% caps out and goes into this pot here. So it becomes more like 7 or 8% of the funds that you have to distribute. So that's, more money for every agency that isn't capping at 30%. Allocated based on performance. Okay, so. Oh, yeah, sorry.
What happens if there's an agency that caps out at 30% in that second?
They would, once you cap out, you cap out. Nobody gets more than 30%.
I'm saying those funds, if they cap out, I guess it would. I think I'm answering my question. So they would go up to 30%, but the funds would still be there distributed.
Yeah, and this formula works so that it will not allow any
Distributes
one
everything.
agency to get more than 30% inclusive of their performance and their sizing amount.
Just to restate it, we're applying the 30% cap in 2 different places now. Once after the sizing metric, and then again in the performance distribution. And that'll iterate until we get all the money out the door.
So we had jumped ahead to look at results in that slide 74, but we're going to walk through the results of this scenario in detail. So a few things, caveats here with respect to the results we're going to show. This is using historic data to show what the allocations would look like in past years if this proposed formula had been in effect. And we do this so that we can illustrate what the real world impact of changes on the formula would be. Some of the information is averaged over the 3-year period. Some of it's based on the single year worth of data. The other thing is that when there's really 2 types of averaging that's happening here. We run the numbers individually to say, what would the allocations have been in 24 if the new formula were? What would it have been in 25? What would it have been in 26? We independently run the formula 3 different times, and we determine what each agency would get. So for agency X, we know how much they would get in 24, 25, and 26. Then we average those 3 amounts together to summarize what the overall results would be. It's different than a 3-year average. Going into the formula, this is the 3-year average of results. And that helps us to show, given multiple years worth of data, how do individual agencies compare? So any one agency's number that you see here in any one year might be a little higher or a little lower than what their 3-year average would be. So it's just important to keep in mind that there's an averaging of the results to help us compare the results. In the future, the allocations will be based on new data. So the proposal here is for the formula to take effect in fiscal year 28, which will be based on fiscal year 26 data, which is the fiscal year we're in right now. So the data based on service from July 1st, 2025 to June 30th, 2026 will be the basis for these FY 28 allocations. And those future allocations may differ materially because of some of the things we just heard about. So first of all, the total amount of funding available from the Commonwealth may be different in FY 28, and the whole pool could change in terms of what you're trying to allocate. There could also be changes in the total operating performance metrics, so the extent to which we change the formula could be at issue. Individual agencies operating and performance metrics will change, and then their change relative to each other could be an issue. And to provide probably, the most illustrative example here, the fact that some agencies have seen such a terrific return to transit in recent months with sort of a stronger federal in-office mandate for workers means that, we'll have to see, but in some cases, the FY26 data, especially for ridership, could be significantly different from FY25 and from other years' data that we're applying here. So the best we can work with right now is the historic data we have, but for reasons that I've just explained, that future data may be different, and so that's important to keep in mind here. The last point on here is what we're trying to evaluate is the policy goals. Is this achieving the goals that we have for what we want to achieve at the Commonwealth level, as opposed to is one individual agency made better or worse here? There are individual agencies that see changes in their funding here, and that's an important part of the overall picture, but we're trying to get at, does this move the needle in the direction that we're hoping to achieve at a statewide level? So with respect to the changes in funding under, is there a question there before I? Okay. So we're going to look first at these results several different ways. We've looked at this in the past, but we'll formalize it again. First, we looked by construction district, which coincides with the districts on the Commonwealth Transportation District Board. Commonwealth Transportation Board, sorry. So the districts give you some sort of summary of how different regions of the state do here. And we can see that with this proposed change in formula, we have in red, Fredericksburg and Northern Virginia are the two districts that see the biggest decline. Any of the other districts see a gain in funding: Hampton Roads, Lynchburg, Richmond, and Salem. There are some that see a relatively small change in funding in dollar and percentage terms. So that's Stanton, Bristol, and Culpeper. And then ex-multi, those are the agencies that span multiple districts and are hard to say, assign them to different districts because they operate across multiple districts. So they get combined into their own special slot on the bottom of the table. So Fredericksburg sees a 7% decline in funding, an $80,000 decline in funding. Northern Virginia sees a 3% decline in funding, which is about $1.8 million for the region. And you can see how that compares. I mean, the gains that you see in Hampton Roads, Lynchburg, Richmond, and Salem roughly equal what's lost in Northern Virginia with this change in formula. We can see it visually here by district, so you can see how the total amounts of funding change by district. So blue is what they would get under the current approach, orange is what they would get under the revised approach. So you can see what we just looked at in tabular form. It shows you graphically how much everybody's getting now. How it changes. So we also have the results by individual operator. So that's what this table shows. And most agencies stay within plus or minus 5% of their current allocations. You can see pretty much everybody changes some. Somebody was asking who are the 30 agencies that cap out at 30%. Those tend to be the ones that see no change in their funding. So Blacksburg, Harrisonburg, and Blackstone are three of the ones that are capping out. Therefore, their numbers don't change at all. And you can see we've highlighted in green the ones that saw a significant change in percentage or dollar terms. The ones in pink are the ones that saw a decline in percentage or dollar terms. The significant outliers here are Fairfax County, who's right here. Really significant part of the decline, $1.6 million or 6%. PRTC, $745,000 or 9%. FXB Go, that region, so it's the same district number we were looking at, $80,000 decline or 7%. And then the gainers are GRTC Richmond, which is right here. So they gained 748,000, 4%. Arlington County gains 300,000 or 5%. Valley Metro, so right here is Greater Roanoke Transit Company on this table. They gain 231,000 or 7%. Lynchburg gains 219,000 or 13%. So that's the average of the individual results we do for each year, 24 through 26. Take the average of how they've all changed, how they all changed relative to what these agencies actually received in those 3 years. We can also see how this changes things by agency. So for this graph, we split it in two. These are the smaller 2 quartiles of agencies. So most of these agencies gain, these smaller agencies, and their funding caps out. The highest one here is just over, just around $850,000 funding. And you can see the smallest one, Pony Express, is getting a very small amount of money at the other end of the scale here. So there's 2 here, 15 decline in funding, Pony Express and Greensville. Everybody else has a green arrow that's gaining. District 3 sees 0 change. So most of these are seeing some gain, and the 2 that see a loss here is negative. So upper 2 quartiles. So this one's capping out now at 25 million. So significantly higher scale on this one. And you can see that there's about half the agencies here that have a red arrow that are seeing a decline in funding. And we can see what each change of their funding is next to the label at the bottom. And you can see graphically here, if it's going from gray down, they're losing funds. If it's going from gray up to blue, then they're gaining funds. So in this graph, gray is the allocations under current, blue is the allocation under the revised approach. So you can see Fairfax, HRT, you see both gaining, dash is pretty flat, UMPC going down, Arlington going up a little bit. A little bit harder to see the variation of the other scale here on this graph for the other 2 quartiles. One other thing I'll highlight is that we computed what the change in funding was between large urban and small urban or rural systems. Probably not a surprise because we saw almost everybody gaining on that previous slide, and most of those agencies are the ones that would count as small urban or rural. So small urban sees a gain in 672,000, which is a 3.6% gain for them. That money comes at the expense of large urban, which saw a decline of 672,000 or 6%. The smaller percent for the large urbans because they're getting more money relative to the small urban and rural. Okay, so then we've got our scatter plot, which shows how do the agencies compare in dollar and percentage terms. So this is same data as we were looking at on the previous slide, but showing it in terms of who is gaining if you're in this quadrant. Gaining funds under the revised approach. This quadrant here, these agencies are seeing less funding under this revised approach. And similar to what we were talking about earlier, these are the same blue dots that were on that slide 74. The allocations with using just a single year of data to make the performance allocation. So we have Fairfax, PRTC, FXB Go here, Richmond, HRT, Arlington, Valley Metro, Bradford, Lynchburg, and CSPDC. Everybody else, if you happen to be along this axis here, they are seeing very little change in their funding in percentage terms. The higher you go, the more you spread this way, the more your dollar changes. So we can see for some of these agencies in dollar terms, they're not seeing very significant change in their dollars. Like this one here, it's a pinky finger's width in dollar terms, but it's that much in percentage terms. So it's a big impact for that particular agency. Radford's an example of that, where it's a small dollar impact, but large percentage.
So question, obviously, again, we're doing a snapshot of time. Next year's data is going to be different. Is there an opportunity for us to say this new formula will reward A, B, C, D, E? So transit agencies knows, again, how can they behave to be rewarded in this? It's so easy for folks to look at this data. This is hypothetical and it's actually old data. But what can they learn in terms of, if we have a proposed formula, is there a nice, easy statement that can be crafted that says, if you perform in these ways, that poises you well to at least stay the same, if not improve. And maybe I'm overly simplifying, but we all need to do that for a minute.
I think you could, because we know what's changing, and to the extent you are, your sizing emphasizes more service, more ridership, that's going to drive more funding for you. That's what's driving most of this, is the change in sizing. And then the performance stuff, we know, what are the three factors that go into your performance allocation, and to the extent you're being cost and service efficient, that's should theoretically drive more funding for the.
There's value, I think, in the communication of this. If they say this proposal, it rewards this type of behavior, might be a very easy way to get through all of the details so folk can really understand.
Can I just follow up on that and ask specifically about this? If I wanted to say that one way you could benefit yourself would be for your localities to contribute more to transit, because then you're increasing the operating cost, get a 30% cap up a little higher.
That's true.
Is that true? Okay.
And I think what you're both saying is really important, of like, how do we communicate this, both so it's easy for people to understand why we're making the changes, but what you can do to change your outcome, especially since we are saying we're relying more on absolute performance measures. So there should be more chance to do that. Otherwise, I worry you look at it and you're like, okay, so is the message we just want to reward rural at the cost of urban? No, we don't want to do that. We want all ships to rise, right? But that depends on the funding that we get in. Transit's important all across the state, but what can you do regardless if you're an urban or you're a rural or a suburban transit agency?
And that's part of it. The worry I always have is that folks go to running the numbers and there's winners and losers, but they're winners and losers of that hypothetical scenario. So how can they be winners as we move forward?
The only thing I'll add to
More
it is that
outcome, output oriented, efficient use of.
Let's plain language.
And I think we can do that for the external messaging much easier when you move to direct measures and away from the trend-based adjustments.
Okay.
The one thing that I will say in this room is that everything's moving at once.
I know, because it's all compared to everybody else.
The way we have to say it is you're positioning yourself to do better, but others may be positioning themselves to do better as well,
Right.
which means that you may not do it. Right. And so that's for this room to understand. But the messaging outward is that, like, if you maximize these metrics, you should position yourself to do better in the formula.
We're also demonstrating commitment to more transit rather than less. And so pressure to increase the total pool would follow, I would think.
So go get more funding, go get more, expand services. It'll help you.
So there are some additional methodological approaches that we could look at here, and some of them involve needing that additional data that we've talked about earlier. So this is a piece we've sort of beaten to death already. So I hope that we've discussed that in earnest about the need for additional data. But the other two things that I think are possibilities here that, we didn't have time to explore this past year, but I think are potential solutions to think about are, do you look at a tiered allocation by mode? Do you say bus, paratransit, commuter rail, commuter bus, all have their own pool of funds, and you're competing against other paratransit providers and for funding. Few things that complicate something like that is you'd have to think about how you do overhead cost allocation, because, you know, you don't want someone to gain, we're gonna tank our paratransit numbers so that we boost our bus number and get all of our, get more money that way as an agency. So overhead cost allocation is really important between modes. And then the other thing is you've got to think about how are you going to partition the funds between modes? What becomes your basis for how much of the pool should motor bus get? How much should transit get? How much should
How much rural get versus urban versus?
well, and then that's the other is you could do by mode, but then another way you could tier it is to say the large urbans are one pool and the small urbans are another. So these two are two different approaches. One's by mode and the other's by agency type. And there's, you know, merits to one versus the other. Because that's one thing with the current approach is that some of these agencies we think of as a commuter bus agency, for example, but they also have paratransit and they have local bus that they operate. All their operating statistics for all the services that an agency operates all get thrown into the same pool and are all evaluated together in terms of their performance and their sizing. So, you know, there's characteristics of these agencies that are dominant in terms of how they measure up. But, you know, we don't have a pure comparison of, you know, this is just the commuter bus agency versus the other bus agencies, because everything all for a given operator, everything they operate regards to the mode is all combined together. So that's something that could be investigated. The other is, say you divide the funds and this is a pool for the large urbans, this is a pool for the small urbans, and rural. You could do rural separately if you wanted to or not. You know, you can make a policy decision on that. There are FTA definitions for when agencies are in each bucket, so you don't have to be the judge of who's who, because you've got some information on that. There is a little bit of a challenge there on the margin. Some agencies are operating a little bit of both. So that becomes tricky. So like think around the Charlottesville area, for example, where there's elements of rural, but then also an urban system that they operate. So how would you categorize an agency like that? So again, you need standardized performance measures to do this. Need to account for different types of services. And you've got the same issue you have with the upper row, which is how do you partition between the tiers? What becomes the basis for here's how much the pool should be for large urban versus small urban and rural? Do you do it based on population? Do you do it based on some measure of service? Do you do it based on revenue vehicles, revenue vehicle hours, or revenue vehicle miles, ridership, operating costs? You know, you go right back to the same measures you're already using to somehow bucket the funds by tier. So that's part of the challenge with that. But these are all potential approaches for further consideration.
And insofar that if DRPT examines this, you actually did a lot of this work in 2017, because to get where we are now, a lot of these things were examined. It might be worthwhile to go back and look at what things kind of led to where we are. Again, it could open it back up, but I know we had a lot of conversations, especially looking at, do you look at the FTA models of urbanized? And some of the things you just brought up were some of those considerations. I don't remember all of them, but I do know that DRPG did a lot of work in this space. So it might just be sort of dusting off and see if there's any valuable nuggets to pull out of there to already learn from, you know, before you spend money.
I think too, it's important to keep in mind that there's been some incremental progress over the years to address some of the challenges that were identified in 2017, like VRE and WMATA used to be part of this whole formula, and now they have their own allocations off the top. That did simplify things quite a bit because that took two very different agencies off the table. And as much as we say, well, these are apples and oranges between these 40 agencies that we still have in this formula, they're at least the bananas have been. So we're focused in on a little more common set of agencies here.
Hey, Nate, I do want to give a time warning. So we have about 25 minutes till we hit 2 o'clock. There is some legislation that's pending that we'd like to talk about as a TSDAC before we move on. I think in the interest of time, is there anything else on the slide deck that we needed to hit for this group? Okay.
We're right to discussion.
Discussion, right?
Okay, so I think what we want to do is open up to have a conversation around the pending legislation that's out there. Depending on where we are on time, I have been making notes feverishly throughout the meeting on things that I think we need to deep dive into. If we get to a cutoff point in the meeting, being respectful of everybody's time where we can't whiteboard that out, we'll draft it up, we'll send it out to all of you to get feedback to make sure we've captured everything. Because we want to make sure we set up each subsequent meeting to address anything that comes up in the meeting that we're in. But I'll stop there. We can turn it over to Chair McGlennon to start to talk about legislation a bit.
Yes, and before we do that, let me just make a plea to, I know we have a lot of folks on from the agencies today. Our next meeting is February 10th. And so that's only 3 weeks away, but we've had a significant presentation of information today. And what I would ask you is to give serious thought to any questions you may have, any reactions you might have, and if possible, feed those to us early so that we can have answers and, or at least some additional information for the next meeting. Our goal really is to try to knock out things that we can arrive at a consensus on and move forward. So if I could get you to do that, it would be very, very helpful. And we will, of course, provide opportunities along the way for your understanding is we do not have any public comment cards today, so we'll move past that. And I'd ask Kate if she would mind briefing us on some legislation that's coming out of Northern Virginia related to transit, and she's graciously agreed to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to start that off, the two pieces of legislation we're tracking benefit all transit in the Commonwealth. I think it's really important. And if nobody walks away with any other message, that's really important to understand that. As many of you know, it was something that sort of put together in Northern Virginia was the SJ28 Joint Subcommittee on Transit Funding Needs. That's not the exact name, but I think we all know what it was. But it really led to a full deep dive in understanding the needs associated with transit. And honestly, it was great data we got from DRPT with some support for the Virginia Transit Association to understand what that meant statewide. So there actually are two parallel pieces of legislation that are going on right now, either of which gets at increasing state aid for transit systems, and also then, because it did start from a Northern Virginia place, is some opportunities in Northern Virginia to raise Northern Virginia revenues for Northern Virginia additional transit needs. So both of these pieces of legislation have that end game. They just get at them a little bit differently. The first one I want to mention is HB 1179. That's Delegate Kathy Tran. If you go back to then those folks who are following, Senator Eben was the lead for the SJ28. He has asked Kathy Tran to carry this bill in the House. We're still waiting to see. I guess there's a holdup on getting some of the Senate bills out right now. But anyway, there will be a Senate companion bill. And so in 1179 is a very much focus on public transit. It looks at actually identifying specific revenues, including a statewide retail package fee of 50 cents a transaction. So think of your deliveries to your home, as well as putting the sales tax that we have right now, just a standard statewide sales tax on services like Uber and Lyft, your TNCs. By doing so, that would go directly into the Commonwealth Mass Transit account. So this is where, if you guys following the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, transit is one little part of it. This would actually send all of those revenues just to the mass transit. By doing so and doing some reallocation of some of the percentages in the way that the DRPT funding, holding a lot of things harmless, but actually boosting, is looking at a potential 70% increase in operating assistance. So when we talk about the merit operating assistance here, if this goes through, there's a 70% increase in dollars. We will be back having this conversation, a good conversation to have, but I'm sure we'll be re-examining a lot of these things. The other thing that's in here, and it's also in the other bill as well, is something that was actually intended to have happened in the omnibus bill in 2020. It just didn't come way. Is actually, when we talk about state gas tax, the state gas tax right now has something that's called the highway use fee. And that's something if you have a high energy efficient vehicle, you see it on your registration, $40 or whatever it is, depending on, I don't have an electric vehicle, but I have $40 on my little Subaru. So this actually would put highway use fee at every single planning district around the Commonwealth. Now, a lot of those planning districts, that goes straight into the district grant program. This legislation says in those situations, 15% of it needs to be used for public transit. So I just want to kind of highlight that. That's actually in both of the bills I'm going to talk about. And then up in Northern Virginia, establishing a fund in the NVTC district and a fund in the PRTC district that would put together a number of different revenue sources that we analyze that would work well in Northern Virginia. Those would handle capital funding for WMATA, additional funding for VRE, as well as some local funding for our local bus systems. And likewise for PRTC would actually be setting up their dedicated funding for OmniRide because they do not have any dedicated funding source right now from their localities, as well as support their efforts with VRE. And so again, those would be generated in the NVTC and PRTC district for things in the NVTC and PRTC. But the most important thing, as I want you to understand, is 1179 is potentially an over 70% increase in transit operating. And quite frankly, all of the Commonwealth programs for transit would grow, but I wanted to highlight that. So the other bill that's been introduced is a little bit bigger and broader, but there is a transit nexus to it. This is HB 900, which is Delegate Sullivan. This is something he actually inherited over from Mark Sickles, who had been talking about this for a while. As obviously Delegate Sickles is moving into the administration, so Delegate Sullivan has taken this on. And this is about modernizing and actually lowering the sales tax across the Commonwealth of Virginia. So this legislation is looking at taking the statewide sales tax, and I've got to know way too much about sales tax. So if you know more, feel free to correct me or talk to me afterwards. I'm learning while I'm doing this. But statewide sales tax is 4.3%. Every locality has a 1% option. That's why it gets confusing when you see different numbers. But this would overall lower the sales tax statewide, still provide that 1% option, local option. But what it does is it broadens what gets taxed. There are a number of different states where services are considered to get sales tax. And so this would expand and broaden that. For those of you who've been following this space for a while, this is some of the things that Delegate Watts has been putting out for many years. And so she does have another bill that has a little bit different transit stuff, but this one's got some transit benefits to it. Big picture is basically anything that touches the sales tax would see an increase in revenues. So we're talking about potentially upwards of, we got to get some better impact statements on it, but it could be close to 200 million a year directly back to localities for their 1% option. So that's a serious increase to localities sales tax that they get. About 850 million a year in new statewide revenues. And this is for the general fund. And then in our special little place called transportation, it could actually increase by about 450 million a year transportation activities, which would also include things like I-81, I-64, Amtrak. So our rail friends would see an increase, as well as the Commonwealth Transit Fund. And so that's where the boats lift for transit is actually an increase of the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund. And in this situation, again, where it stands as introduced is probably about a 20% increase in operating funds for the transit systems. So they both get somewhere in a really positive way. They're just a little bit different way of doing it. I think the other thing I wanted to add in for those who are tracking is any of the regional authorities that get gas tax, well, there's gas tax, but also get income tax or sales tax, I should say, would also see a boost. So I know the NVTA up in Northern Virginia would get a boost. CVTA would get a boost. I think HR TAC, I'm still learning all these different authorities would see a boost in that. So again, 1179 and 900, both House bills that are out right now are ones to watch. We need one or the other. You couldn't put them together because they're different. But they both are, again, seeking the end game of lifting up transit funding statewide, as well as for us setting up some regional funds that could support our specific WMATA, VRE, and local bus needs. So,
anybody have any questions for Kate?
Which one would you prefer? Or do you?
Oh, I have no position. Oh, no.
The one that can get passed.
There you go. No, honestly, yeah, I think that.
Do they both pretty much give the same for Northern Virginia, though?
Well, they do, but they don't. They do because they both set up similar pots in our region, but the state aid element There's one that's obviously, because we also get the benefits we see
Right.
from the merit program. We have not taken a position on either of them. Our position is that we want to support public transit. So any bills that can make that happen, I think. are really important. And by the way, there's probably a lot more bills that are out there related to public transit. These are the two about funding that we've seen thus far. So I do hope that others are watching. I do know there's some things about labor. That's really important, I think, for folks to just pay attention to what that looks like for your localities. But there'll be a lot more on this. Obviously, we have two new patrons, really supportive of being champions of this, but they're also getting up to speed since the original patrons are now in the administration. Unprecedented times, some would say.
I would say that Calades, VML, and VACO will be taking position, but we're also still evolving.
Right.
And so February 5th will be our local government day.
I'm sorry, if you don't mind, just before we leave, just know HB 900 Sullivan, there's a lot of technical edits in the drafting. The drafting had a lot of errors in it, so we're working very diligently to get those in there. So if you see something, just let us know and we can examine whether that was something of the intent of the drafters or not. There's definitely some things that were not caught before that deadline, so.
So the technical amendments and the actual fiscal impact is going to be really important.
Yes.
As I can say, I think having fun with the General Assembly regularly, my next part of today will be down the street. Broader it is statewide, likely to pass, but the other one having 70% increase for transit. But
they're both very
localities are
positive.
going to have interesting challenges because it's impacting sales tax, grocery tax, personal hygiene. There's a lot of little new ones.
Right, and of course, we also have some business taxes that would be affected by this that aren't currently subject to the sales tax.
So it's good for us all to know with the transit hat on, it's one focus.
But
And all those conversations, and of course, it'll be very interesting to see how the administration, what position they may take on these.
being able to lower the overall rate, I think makes it much more attractive to
And
think
today,
about
there's
that.
actually a bill being increasing 1% sales tax for school construction.
Right.
So let's just have fun. But
We already have that 1%, so.
you're lucky.
Yeah, we're lucky.
The rest of us want it.
The rest of us are gonna be doing it like this.
All right, any other
Thank you.
comments, questions? I think it's been a very productive day, and appreciate all the good work that everybody's done, benefiting from our new members very much, and once again, all those of us who've been around this few years can still bring some fresh eyes to matters. So that's, I think, it's great. Maria, would you like to say anything else?
No, it was a great discussion. Wonderful to be here with you all and excited the work we have to achieve here over the next year. But as we discussed, there also are some big unknowns at play that I'm struck as the conversation's unfolding. Both the new ridership data, the timing of that, the timing of when we may know what the funding future is for transit. All of this is sort of colliding with the deadline that was imposed with us on this. So I am hopeful that collectively we can think about that timing, if that's something that needs to be revisited, or if we think we can be on track, or there's a plan A or a plan B, depending how things take shape. We will know hopefully a little bit more. Not everything, but the next set of meetings here, I know there was a request from folks both that we are able to meet in person more often, but also to know with more notice when the meetings are happening. So put holds on your calendars for these dates as well. And I know, Jennifer, you want to talk a little bit about next steps too, so that we're sure we're capturing any follow-up to help us prepare for that February meeting and outstanding questions and how we want to best utilize that time. So thanks again, everyone. It's great to join you.
February date's good for many reasons. It's 4 days before crossover, so we should kind of know where some of the funding's heading.
Yes, that's true.
And just to mention, we did, I think, pretty much put the capital issue to not to bed, but to say that we have pretty much a consensus, but are still open to any concerns or questions that might arise.
Thank you. So what we'll do, we'll get out notes from today's meeting in the next day or two. We'll want to hear back from you guys pretty quickly, just because we want to make sure we have time to develop the presentation and ensure we're getting out things to you a week in advance, so you have time to read it and review it. If we can get it out even sooner than that, we will. But we only have 3 weeks to work with, so we'll do this in, like I said, the next day or two. If you have reactions to it, or you say, no, we need to deep dive into this, let Zach and I know. And we'll make sure we make adjustments to the agenda and get that out to you guys as quickly as we can. But this was a great meeting. Next time, we're gonna allow more time to whiteboard and workshop, because we want to hear from all of you and let you have time for discussion. So we will try to plan our presentations accordingly, but we really wanted to get everybody just back up to speed on where we were, since we'd had a little break since last time. But hopefully we can cut it down from 75 slides to something shorter next go round.
And Paul, welcome to your first meeting. Yes, Noel.
Yes, Danny Plugger from VTA asked me to remind everyone that Transit Advocacy Day is next Monday, but with the weather, being questionable, it's possible it might be moved to February 2nd.
All right, anything else for the?
Just quick, I thank you for having a lot of stuff already on the website for our meetings. But I guess while it takes time for the agenda and the minutes, if we can get the recording up as soon as possible.
Oh, yeah, it's on
look at
YouTube.
that.
Yeah.
That would be great. Now it has to be 2026.
If I don't hear any question any time, I will adjourn the meeting.
Look at that, 8 minutes early.